Good morning. The committee will come to order. Welcome and thank you for all joining us here today, the full committee legislative hearing. Today we will begin discussing several pieces of important legislation, including draft legislation that I've been working on to establish a permanent, improved Department of Veterans Affairs Care in the Community program. Draft legislation that Ranking Member Walz has been working on to address VA's agreements with state veteran homes, graduate medical education residency positions, community care obligations, and telemedicine licensing issues, and a legislative proposal Secretary Shulkin has been working on, the Veteran Coordinated Access and Rewarding Experiences, or CARE Act. We will also consider legislation this morning that would affect how veterans are able to access life-saving transplant and mental health care, and how VA is able to use telemedicine to treat veterans in rural areas. Needless to say, we have a very full docket this morning. I'm grateful to Ranking Member Walz, to Secretary Shulkin, and all the sponsors of bills on today's agenda for being here this morning and for their hard work on behalf of our veterans. I look forward to hearing the testimony of my colleagues and of the Secretary on various proposals, and for brevity's sake, will limit my comments to my draft bill addressing community care. So let's get started. Earlier this month, the committee hosted a roundtable discussion with VA and numerous veteran service organizations to discuss community care reform. At that roundtable, we had a robust discussion surrounding an earlier version of my community care reform bill. I'm immensely grateful to all the VSOs, members, and other roundtable participants for their support of the earlier draft, their thoughtful suggestions for how it could be improved, and their willingness to meet with me and my staff over the last few weeks to discuss these issues and my language in depth. It's important to note that the written testimony that was submitted for today's hearing is based on an earlier draft of the bill that is before us today. On Friday, a revised version of the bill was circulated that incorporates the feedback that I've received over the last few weeks from VSOs, members, VA, and other stakeholders. Once again, I want to thank all of those who agreed to sit down with me and my staff for being so generous with their time and for their commitment to ensuring that all viewpoints and concerns are heard and considered in the committee's final work product. I made every effort, every step of the way, to be transparent and keep all stakeholders informed about our work and intentions with regard to this bill. To that end, I believe it's important to state yet again that this effort is in no way, shape, or form intended to create a pipeline to privatize the VA healthcare system. I want to be completely clear about that. Everyone who participated in the roundtable earlier this month and contributed to the development of this legislation should be completely clear on that. Everyone listening today should also be completely clear on that. Supplemental care sourced from within the community has been a part of the VA healthcare system since the 1940s, and services to expand VA's reach and strengthen and support the care that VA provides. Rhetoric aside, strengthening and support VA is what this conversation is about. It should go without saying that VA cannot be everywhere, providing everything to every veteran. Expecting VA to perform like that sets up the VA to fail. That's why my draft bill preserves VA's role as a central coordinator of care for enrolled veteran patients. In addition to consolidating VA's menu of existing community care programs into one cohesive program, my bill would create a seamless, integrated VA system of care that incorporates VA providers and VA medical facilities where and when they are available to provide care a veteran seeks, and a network of VA providers in the community who can step up when needed. Under my draft bill, the VA generally retains the right of first refusal, meaning that if VA medical facilities can reasonably provide a needed service to a veteran, that care will be provided in that facility. But when the VA can't do that, my bill would ensure that veterans aren't left out to dry. My bill would also modernize VA's medical claims processing system to ensure that community providers can be expected to be paid on time, every time, and for the care they provide to veterans on VA's behalf. My bill would further require VA to consolidate periodic capacity and market assessments to identify how gaps in care can be addressed through the, improvements to both internal and external capacity. Standardize the rates VA pays to community providers and authorize VA to enter into provider agreements for needed care when contracts are not available or achievable. That said, my bill remains a work in progress, and we still have work to do together. For example, we still need to figure out how to pay for all these improvements, which will be no easy or pleasant feat for any of us, I can assure you. I'm committed to remaining as transparent and open as possible moving forward, and I want everyone here to know the doors of this committee are open to anyone who is honestly interested in working with us to resolve this issue once and for all before the year runs out and the choice funds once again run dry. With that, I look forward to hearing what all of our witnesses have to say this morning and thank them for being here. I'll now yield to Ranking Member Walz for any opening statement that he might have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And earlier this summer, the New York Times did a story, and the headline in it was, if you want to know how Congress is supposed to work, look at the VA committee. That is a testament to Chairman Rowe's leadership. It's a testament to what is basically the who's who of those who care for veterans that are in this room today. For those veterans that'll be watching and following this closely, they expect nothing less of us. They expect nothing less than bipartisanship aimed at common values and outcomes. And for that, I'm grateful. Secretary Shulkin and your team, thank you. It is not a rare occurrence to have you in this room. You're accessible. We pick up the phone. We talk often, and you're always proactive in that, and I think that changes the conversation. To the VSOs are here, we'll talk a little bit about your input that is absolutely invaluable. And we've even been joined by a neighbor to the east of me from Wisconsin, Mr. Leinenkugel. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to come down. And I know you're a busy man, so you may have missed the Vikings and the Packers did play, just by the way. Okay. Thought we would share that. Passive aggressiveness runs deep in Minnesotans, so but thank you for that. Over 3 years ago, the committee worked together under significant public pressure and time constraints to establish the Veterans Choice Program in response to the immediate access to care crisis. At that time, I think we all understood Veterans Choice would be a temporary fix. Aside from using the time to improve VA internal capacity, it also allowed the committee to assess a long-term strategy for consolidating VA's multiple community care programs into one streamlined, easy-to-use program, based on all the lessons learned from Veterans Choice and other community care programs. During this period, the Chairman is absolutely right. We've held countless hearings on the topic, and today we have the opportunity to discuss the product of these hearings, draft legislation to replace the Veterans Choice Program and consolidated community care. I want to begin by thanking the Chairman again and his incredible staff for the hard work on this issue. When you look at their willingness to consider and incorporate stakeholder feedback into their draft, it's evident this is not a partisan issue. It's a veteran issue. And this committee continues to improve that veterans, not politics, come first. In preparation for this hearing, I had the opportunity to go with Congressman Nolan up to International Falls in Couchiching County, Minnesota. They're famous for lots of things and not just being the coldest place in America. And they told me this, to be very clear about it, is that International Falls is not the end of the road, it's the beginning of the road when you come from Canada. And the room was filled with about 100 veterans from all of this nation's conflicts. And just like so many of you and the members who are here hold these hearings all over, we were talking about what it's going to take to deliver that care. And the Chairman is right. It's very difficult. There is no VA hospital in International Falls. The nearest community-based out clinic is miles away. Community care and hospitals are even spread out some, but the willingness of that community hospital is there, a small rural hospital, willingly taking Choice, willingly taking TRICARE, willingly taking CHAMPS VA to try and serve their people. And out of that meeting, and we'll get a chance to talk about it, is some of the things that they want to know we hear about. They love the care they get in the VA, but they don't want to drive to Minneapolis, or more importantly, fly to Minneapolis every time they need it. They want to try and figure out how we can best deliver that care. And so today, the County Veteran Service Officer and the VFW, they're holding a watch party today in the VFW out in International Falls. They wanted to hear what we had to say and ask them, and they're curious about this, just like all of your veterans are. So I thank the VSOs for that engagement. Your members are listening, they're paying attention, and they care deeply about this, and to the VA for their support. Each has continued to provide a level of insight and expertise necessary to make this program work. I'm pleased that we are close to settling on policy underlying a choice replacement program. I'm concerned with how it will be funded, as the Chairman said. I continue to believe that veterans do not benefit when we scrape the barrel for money by skimming from some veterans' benefits or health programs to pay for others. That is something that came out of that meeting. I asked them, if we could deliver everything you're asking for on care, would you be willing to do it with round down and other things? And that causes great consternation amongst that group. We need to have that open, honest dialogue, which we've always had. A program of this magnitude will require more than round downs, and I look forward to learning more about how we plan to pay for this legislation and bring in those stakeholders. A critical component of consolidating community care is improving VA's ability to enter into provider agreements with state veterans' homes. That's why I've included language in the minority draft to do just that. Without the modification of the VA's authority, veterans' access to high-quality nursing homes will decrease. I hope my colleagues will support this legislation as it advances through the committee. We must ensure the needs of our aging veterans population are met and future demand on these services will rise. Today, this committee will also discuss legislation that would improve the current Veterans Choice Program. These improvements include changes to organ transplant authorizations and eligibility. Also, some changes I'm concerned about, such as changes to the eligibility of veterans to seek mental health care from VA, and in certain locations, the eligibility of veterans to seek treatment for military sexual assault. I'm concerned these changes to eligibility could lead to VA ultimately losing its role as the coordinator and the guarantor of one of the most important responsibilities, to provide high-quality mental health care. I believe that by concentrating our efforts within the VA, we can better treat veterans with mental health concerns or that are suffering from military sexual trauma. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. We can do more on this. With that, I would once again thank you, Chairman, for your leadership. Thank you for once again proving that Congress can work and tackling the toughest issues on those shared values. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding in his comments, and I'm honored today to be joined by a number of our colleagues who have sponsored the bills on our agenda and will be joining us on the first panel. With us is Representative Jim Banks from Indiana, who will be testifying from his seat here on the dais. Representative Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, welcome. Judge John Carter from Texas. G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania, and Representative Dr. Neil Dunn from Florida will also be testifying from the dais. Representative Andy Barr, my friend from the north in Lexington, from Kentucky. Representative Banks, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, thank you for holding the hearing today and for including my bill on the agenda. Our gratitude for our service members demands that we address the personal impact of their service. Suicide is our nation's 10th leading cause of death, claiming over 40,000 lives a year. That's almost 5 times as many people as my entire hometown of Columbia City, Indiana. This rate has increased by over 32% since 2001. Veterans account for 18% of those deaths, even though they are only 8.5% of the nation's population. Every day, as we know, 20 veterans die from suicide. Veterans are 22% more likely to commit suicide, and our female veterans are 2.5 times more likely than civilian women. The invisible wounds of PTSD are a large contributing factor, afflicting 11 to 20% of those who have served in war zones. Our veterans were vigilant in fighting for our freedoms. We must be vigilant in addressing their needs. In recognizing the increase from 2001 to 2014, the VA has focused many resources to tackle this issue. One resource is the 24/7 Veterans Crisis Line, or the VCL, which was created in 2007. As of May 2016, the line answered over 2.3 million calls and over 55,000 texts. Emergency services were dispatched over 61,000 times, and there were over 376,000 referrals to VA's suicide prevention coordinators, ensuring veterans reach further care options. The VCL, as you can see, is a critical tool. My draft bill seeks to enable it to be even more effective. In this information age, the power of data analytics can greatly help. An Inspector General report from March of 2017 indicated room for improvement regarding data analysis and performance measures. Currently, there is still no overarching approach to ensure the VA knows the efficacy of the VCL in preventing future suicide attempts after the initial one is prevented, or in how well it is integrated into the entirety of VA's mental health care services. My bill would require the VA to give us quantitative insight regarding the following. First, the VCL is a conduit for veterans to be connected to opportunities for sustained mental health treatment through the VA. Next, It would look for the visibility of the VCL to veterans who have never used VA care, and VA healthcare's effectiveness at ensuring that those receiving physical care find help for any mental needs, and VA mental health care decreasing the chance of a veteran needing to contact the VCL again if the amount of times a veteran contacts the VCL changes outcomes, and lastly, if mental health care's effectiveness, what is mental health care's effectiveness at decreasing suicide risk? These answers will further empower the VA in this fight. We must ensure that our veterans know that they are not alone after the phone call. Suicide attempts usually result from mental health concerns that require further care to find complete resolution. Through talks with veteran service organizations, I have learned of their concern for veterans' information privacy. I share this belief in privacy and seek to maintain it. That is why this bill will not change the nature of the phone conversations. Veterans who wish to are still able to maintain anonymity. Additionally, the bill provides for a study of data from January 1, 2014 through the end of 2018, almost 80% of which has already been collected. The last year of data for 2018 would be acquired no differently or extensively. This bill has no data acquisition purpose at all. It serves solely for data analysis. Another concern raised is the privacy of the information during analysis. This bill does not intend to jeopardize that either. I intend to work with the committee and veterans organizations to ensure that there is no ambiguity allowing for the possibility of any such interpretations. With the quantitative insight this bill would provide, the goal all of us share could be accomplished, which is saving more veterans' lives. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this bill. With the loss of 20 veterans each day, we must do everything that we can. It is our duty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Gallagher, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rowe. Ranking Member Waltz, although I represent the Packers in Congress, that was tough to hear. And distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to join you here today. My draft legislation before you seeks to address the unmet suicide prevention needs of America's military veterans. As my colleague, Mr. Banks, laid out, 20 veterans take their own lives on average each day. And on average, 14 of the 20 veterans who commit suicide each day did not receive care within the VA. In May 2017, Secretary Shulkin stated the following: "Nothing is more important to me than making sure that we don't lose any veterans to suicide. As you know, 20 veterans a day are dying by suicide. That should be unacceptable to all of us. This is a national public health crisis, and it requires solutions that not only the VA will work on, but all of government and other partnerships in the private sector, nonprofit organizations." As a veteran myself, I could not agree more with Dr. Shulkin. That is why my colleague Seth Moulton, a fellow Marine, and I have been working on legislation to address this crisis. Simply stated, our bipartisan legislation would improve veterans' access to evidence-based mental health care services at community or nonprofit mental health providers participating in the Veterans Choice Program. Our bill would allow eligible veterans in need of mental health services to access the care they need on a same-day basis in the community without a referral. This narrow provision would apply only to mental health services in order to address the suicide crisis affecting the men and women who have served our nation. We believe this legislation is sorely needed. In 2016, the VA Center for Innovation published a report titled Veteran Access to Mental Health Services. The report, which is a compilation of interviews with veterans from across the country, is absolutely remarkable. I believe the candor of these findings is truly a testament to the VA's commitment to transparency, and I commend the department for recognizing that some veterans need mental health care choices outside the VA. For example, the report states, for many veterans, private providers and nonprofits that offer confidential, bureaucracy-free access to timely care feel like a positive and desirable alternative to VA processes. The report also states many veterans are dismayed and left feeling like the VA wants to fob them with drugs when they're offered psychotropic medication before exploring non-medicated treatment options. Further, in discussing proposed solutions, the report finds many veterans don't want to use VA services for mental health care, even if the red tape is cleared. So how can we enable other avenues for care that benefit both veterans and non-VA providers? These findings exemplify why Congressman Moulton and I are teaming up to find a bipartisan common-sense solution to this crisis. It's my belief that by allowing eligible veterans access to same-day evidence-based mental health care services at community and nonprofit providers that are credentialed under the Choice Program's Care Delivery Network, veterans in crisis will be able to get the help they need when and where they need it. The United States has now lost more veterans to suicide than the nation has lost in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we believe our nation has a continuing obligation to the men and women who have served to help address their mental health needs. Tragically, only this past Friday, a 33-year-old veteran committed suicide in the parking lot of a Phoenix VA. I would simply say, and I know everyone on the committee feels the same way, that this can't continue. And I believe community-based and nonprofit mental health care providers stand ready to help fill the gap in addressing the unmet need in veterans' mental health care. This legislation would give Dr. Shulkin and his team the ability to allow such providers to meet these urgent needs in order to continue to address what the Secretary has described as his #1 clinical priority. I hope every member of the committee will support this effort. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to working with all of you to move this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Now I'd like to recognize Representative Carter, Judge Carter, and I understand you have some special guests with you today, Judge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and yes, I do, and I'll introduce them in a moment. Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and other members of this committee, it's an honor to speak here before you this morning. Mr. Chairman, thank you for including our bill, H.R. 1133, Veteran Transplant Coverage Act of 2017, in today's hearing. I'm here this morning on behalf of thousands of American veterans who find themselves in need of transplant care. Under current law, a veteran is in critical need of a live donor transplant can't, with their VA coverage, receive a donation from a non-veteran. This excludes children, siblings, and other non-veteran family members, the people a veteran would who would be most likely and willing to enter into a successful organ match. This is unacceptable. My legislation, the Veterans Transplant Coverage Act of 2017, removes unnecessary barriers that prevent veterans from receiving the care they deserve. H.R. 1133 will allow veterans to receive donations from a live donor, regardless if the donor is a veteran or a non-veteran, and allows them to have the procedure done in a non-VA facility if that makes more sense for the patient. This common sense life-saving policy, and I'm proud that it has received robust and bipartisan support as a standalone bill. This legislation is a good fit for the Veterans Coordinated Access and Rewarding Experience, CARE Act, because it seeks to give veterans more options when it comes to their health care, both in donors and providers. This is especially beneficial for veterans who live in rural areas far away from the closest VA medical center, to say nothing of the closest VA transplant facility. Mr. Chairman, I want to take the time to pause and recognize my constituents, the inspiration for this bill. Mr. and Ms. Charles Nelson and their son Cody, who are here from Leander, Texas, a city in my district.
Please stand if you would.
Mr. Nelson, 100% disabled, service-connected veteran, served his country and ran into this roadblock. That's why we're here today. They brought up what I thought was a common sense, crazy thing that should be changed. I want to thank them for coming out here and doing this, and they care enough about it to come all the way here from Texas to let you know they care. Mr. Nelson, a 100% disabled service-connected veteran, served his country and did everything his grateful nation asked him to. Unfortunately, while serving in Korea, he developed kidney disease, which further led to a need of a kidney transplant. His then 28-year-old son, Cody, was a willing donor and a match. Initially, Mr. Nelson was told the surgery would be covered under VA Choice Program of 2014 and able to be performed at the University Hospital in San Antonio. However, because his son was not a veteran, the VA Central Office denied coverage and costs. The Nelsons were forced to use Medicare and private donations and their own savings to cover the surgery costs. Mr. Nelson deserves better. Our veterans deserve better. VA Health should be there to address the health care needs of those who have served our country in uniform. For Mr. Nelson, who served our nation bravely, to be forced to solicit donations to cover life-saving medical treatment was a failure of the VA system and an insult to his service. I'm proud to represent Mr. Nelson and the more than 84,000 veterans in my congressional district. Each of them, along with the 22 million nationwide, deserve access to life-saving transplant procedures, regardless of donor, in a facility that makes sense for them and their family. I hope that with the passage of H.R. 1133, Veterans Transplant Coverage Act of 2017, and of the entire Veteran Coordinated Access and Rewarding Experience CARE Act, our veterans can access the care they need in the best facility through their VA coverage. Our veterans deserve nothing less than the very best, and the best we can offer them for their service. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Waltz, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today. I want to thank all the members of this committee for their service to our country and to our veterans. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, General Gilding, and Mr. and Ms. Nelson, thank you and your son Austin for being here today, and thank you for bringing this up to Judge Carter. It is that you can see that your particular situation will benefit many, many veterans in the future and their families, and I want to thank you personally for you being here and coming all the way from Texas up here. And just to remind you, there wouldn't be a Texas if it weren't for Tennessee. I want to point that out. But I, too, served in Korea. I appreciate your service. And once again, we very much appreciate what you have done for veterans of this country in your service. Judge, thank you. Now, my friend G.T. Thompson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, thank you so much for inviting me to testify before the House Veterans Affairs Committee. With regards to H.R. 2123, the Veterans E-Health and Telemedicine Support Act, also known as the VETS Act. The issues before this committee are critically important to ensure that those who have selflessly served our nation receive the care and support that they rightfully deserve. With this in mind, a constituent approached me a few years ago to discuss the barriers to care that his fellow veterans were experiencing through the VA system. As an active duty soldier, he told me the stories of his friends coming home from deployments and falling through the cracks in our systems. Some were suffering post-traumatic stress disease, some traumatic brain injury and depression, and required the care of specialists. Others had difficulty traveling from their rural communities to VA medical centers because of the injuries sustained during combat. It broke my heart to hear the stories of this soldier's friends not receiving the care that they deserve, and quite frankly, many of them wound up taking their own lives. What made it more difficult was the fact that this constituent, this soldier, was my son. After numerous conversations about how we can help our service members when they return home, we determined that expanding access to telehealth would be a great start. Many of our veterans live in rural areas and are unable to travel far distances. Allowing them to see their health care provider in the comfort of their home would increase their access to care. As a result, I introduced the Service Members Telemedicine and E-Health Portability Act of 2011, or the STEP Act. Now, this bill allowed the Department of Defense healthcare professionals and contractors to provide telehealth care to members of our armed forces anywhere in the country, even across state lines. And that bill was included in the fiscal year 2012 NDAA, which was subsequently signed into law. The STEP Act has allowed more than 32,000 servicemen and women to gain access to telehealth and has been the basis for a number of telehealth expansions throughout the years. The DoD recently decided to expand telehealth care for recipients of TRICARE based on the success of that legislation. The STEP Act has proven that telemedicine can be expanded safely and responsibly across state lines. And while DoD patients can receive telehealth care no matter where they are located, those who receive care through the VA are not afforded the same liberties. That's why Representative Julia Brownlee, a proud member of this committee, and I introduced H.R. 2123, the Veterans eHealth and Telemedicine Support Act. The VETS Act will similarly allow VA-employed health care providers to practice telehealth across state lines, no matter where the doctor or the patient is located. It also commissions a study of the effectiveness of telemedicine programs utilized by the Department of Veterans Affairs. And while the VA has made major strides in advancing telehealth access, outdated barriers limits its growth. My bill will eliminate these barriers by giving VA-employed providers an exemption to practice telehealth across state lines. Currently, each state has its own licensing requirements for healthcare providers to practice medicine within its borders. For example, if a doctor has offices in Pennsylvania, Ohio, they must hold a license from each state. VA provider licensing requirements are different. As long as the doctor is licensed and in good standing in a single state, they can practice in-person care within the VA system in any state. This reciprocity, however, is not afforded to their practice of telehealth. VA providers seeking to provide telehealth care to patients must also be licensed in the state where the patient is located. And while this licensing requirement can be waived if both the doctor and the patient are located in a federal facility, such as a VA medical center, this still forces a veteran to travel to a VA facility and applies a separate, unnecessary level of regulation to VA telehealth providers. These outdated regulations are hurting our nation's veterans. The Department of Veterans Affairs has successfully been using telemedicine for quite some time. Since 2002, more than 2 million veterans have received telehealth care through the VA. In 2016 alone, more than 12% of veterans receiving VA care utilized telehealth in some capacity. 45% of these veterans live in rural areas. Veterans who have access telehealth are overwhelmingly pleased with the quality of care and access they've received. Those receiving at-home care, for example, cite an 88% satisfaction rate. The VETS Act continues to expand telehealth access for veterans in a responsible manner, allow states to hold providers accountable while increasing access to quality care for veterans who need it. The VETS Act is a result of legislators, practitioners, and advocates coming together to negotiate workable language in good faith, and these efforts will result in veterans across the country gaining access to quality care in the comfort of their homes. Our veterans should receive the best care available to them, and this starts with the passage of the VETS Act. Again, thank you, Chairman Rowe and Ranking Member Waltz, for inviting me to testify before the committee, and I look forward to working with you to expand access to quality care for all our veterans. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Dr. Dunn, you now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rowe and Ranking Member Waltz, for including my bill, H.R. 2601, the Veterans Increased Choice for Transplant Organs and Recovery Act, VICTOR Act, in today's legislative hearing agenda. I also want to thank all of the witnesses here for their testimony. It goes without saying that timely organ transplants can make the difference between life and death. It's always a race to bring the organ and the transplant team together on time. Patients have to be ready at a moment's notice, and the stakes and the risks are always high. The Department of Veterans Affairs has participated in transplant medicine since 1962, but is a relatively small program, which is limited both by scope and location. As a result, veterans in need of organ transplants suffer unique challenges in trying to receive transplant care. Currently, when a veteran receives care through the VA for a transplant, they are forced to travel to one of only 14 VA transplant centers throughout the United States. This means that a veteran must be required to travel hundreds or even thousands of miles across several states for a transplant, despite potentially passing many other transplant centers on the way. To illustrate this point, in the United States, there are currently 147 liver transplant centers. 141 of those are civilian, and 6 are in the veteran system. As a veteran in Florida who needs a liver transplant, there's 7 liver transplant centers in Florida, but they can't go to any of them. They have to travel to Nashville or to Pittsburgh. Similarly, a veteran in California has 13 transplant centers in their state, but cannot go to any of them. The difficulties associated with transplant care are particularly apparent with liver transplants, given the incidence of end-stage liver disease in the veteran population. Liver transplants are especially important, especially life-saving, and common concern within the VA system. Out of the 14 veteran centers, just 6 of these transplant centers are designated for liver transplants. And for those veterans who are waiting for a liver transplant at a veteran center, they face a 32% increase in waiting time compared to civilian centers. The VICTOR Act addresses these challenges by simply reducing the existing barriers to care. If a veteran who needs a transplant lives more than 100 miles away from a veterans transplant center, the bill allows them to seek care at any federally approved transplant center closer to them that also treats Medicare patients. Speaking as a surgeon, a veteran, and a former student of Tom Starzl, the father of liver transplants, this is the right thing to do. This policy change in transplant medicine builds on our larger strategy to improve the quality of health care access for those who, as Lincoln said, shall have borne the battle. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Walz, for allowing me to testify today on behalf of 2601. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Congressman Barr, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Chairman Rowe and Ranking Member Walz for allowing me the opportunity to speak before the House Veterans Affairs Committee and all the members of the committee this morning about providing access to community care for survivors of military sexual trauma, or MST, which my legislation, H.R. 3642, the Military Sexual Assault Victims Empowerment Act, also known as the Military SAVE Act, helps to improve. According to the findings of the Department of Veterans Affairs National Screening Program, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 100 men report that they have been victims of military sexual assault during their time serving in the military. This problem was first brought to my attention by a group of very courageous and inspirational female veterans in the 6th Congressional District of Kentucky, led by MST therapist Karen Tufts. Sadly, due in part to the emotional trauma as a result of their MST experiences, 2 women that were part of this group were lost to suicide. In fact, according to an independent nationwide study conducted by the National Victim Center, the Medical University of South Carolina, and Florida State University, research has found that female victims of MST are 14 times more likely to commit suicide than women who have never been assaulted. In addition, according to the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization, sexual assault is also commonly associated with adverse mental health outcomes such as depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and non-suicidal self-injury, which are also commonly associated with suicidal ideation, attempts, and death by suicide. While Congress has taken several actions recently to better protect survivors of MST within the military justice system, many survivors have expressed concern that services available within the Department of Veterans Affairs healthcare system may still not match their specific post-MST needs. This is why I've been working closely with this committee, veteran service organizations, and my VA Pilot Program Development Task Force in the 6th District of Kentucky to improve medical care for survivors of MST in order to help get those survivors the care that best fits their unique physical and psychological needs. This legislation would allow survivors of MST the ability to seek treatment specifically related to their MST injuries by a private healthcare provider of their choice during a 3-year pilot program. MST survivors would be given a choice to participate in this pilot program or remain in the VA healthcare system for treatment options. Participants in both this pilot program and those being treated within the VA healthcare system for MST-related injuries would participate in a pre-treatment and post-treatment survey, as well as a development survey conducted every 6 months to study individual progress. This pilot program would study the results of the effects that direct access care provides that the VA does not. A certified VA researcher will be assigned as a member of the VA Community Care Office, which will ensure the quality and integrity of collecting and analyzing data for the study, which would then be submitted to Congress for review. As I mentioned before, this legislation was developed with the contributions of many interested parties. It has been through the dedicated support and trusted advice of MST survivors themselves and subject matter experts who are members of the VA Pilot Program Development Task Force. And we created this task force by carefully selecting each of these outstanding and, in many cases, courageous individuals who helped develop and determine what best possible pilot program for MST survivors should look like. Each of these members brought a unique experience and different skill sets to the table, which was ideal for this task force, and I thank them all for their contributions. In conclusion, I ask that this legislation be included in the Veteran Coordinated Access and Rewarding Experiences CARE Act in order to provide survivors, both male and female, the proper medical care that best fits their unique medical needs, care that they have earned through the service to their country. Again, thank you for allowing me to testify before this committee today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about this legislation. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. And now I'll just simply ask the panel. I know that the members have other places they need to be, but I'll just simply now open it up. First to my colleagues over here. Does anyone have a question of the panel? Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses who are here today and participating in our hearing. We will be considering the Choice 2.0 legislation later this morning, and I'm looking forward to that discussion, but I'd like to just briefly note my support for one of the bills that were presented this morning, H.R. 2123, the VET Act. It's been my pleasure to work with Congressman Thompson on this bill, and I thank him for all his efforts pushing the bill forward. This bill really came out of a field hearing last year that I held with our health chairman, Dr. Wenstrup. During that hearing in my district in Ventura County, the VA testified about their growing and successful telemedicine program. The rapid growth of technology has created new possibilities for providing timely, quality health care that best suits veterans' needs, including care at home. The VA has seen tremendous growth and interest in telehealth, and we should continue to find innovative ways to connect veterans with the providers that they need, no matter their physical location. This will particularly help rural veterans and is a key way to expand access to specialty care from the medical centers to the CBOCs and even into the veteran's home. Under current law, however, VA doctors can only provide telehealth treatment across state lines if the veteran and the doctor are located in federal facilities. The VETS Act removes those barriers and allows VA providers to offer treatment free of this restriction. After significant discussions with the relevant stakeholders, including a roundtable last month, we found widespread agreement about this fix. I'd like to enter into the record a recent letter of support for the VETS Act from a broad coalition of patient groups, provider organizations, employers, and payers. This is a targeted fix that will help strengthen the telemedicine program at VA. The VA recently took steps to address this through executive action, which I think is a good step forward, and our bill will codify that action into law. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding, and without objection, those letters are submitted to the record. Anyone else have a question? Mr. O'Rourke.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick comment. I want to thank all of my colleagues who brought very thoughtful legislation forward, and for the fact that so much of it has been inspired by the real-life circumstances of their constituents, the veterans that they're here to serve in Congress. And I want to especially thank Judge Carter for highlighting the Nelson family and for the example that you give, which is incredibly motivating to us. Sometimes we discuss policy in the abstract, but to actually see you here and know of your sacrifice, I agree with the chairman that it is not going to just be better for you and others in Leander and Texas. It's really going to be good for veterans across the country. And so I want to thank you for being the inspiration for this, and Judge Carter for bringing it to us and to our attention, and hope that it is successful in passing. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And before he leaves here, Coach Luce, hold on just a second before you leave. Whether they caught him or not. I'll get that a little bit later. Anyone else? Well, if there are no further questions, the first panel is excused, and I will introduce the second panel momentarily. Yeah, the gentleman that was leaving is one of my very dear friends who just retired as head basketball coach where I went to college for 27 years. He's the winningest coach in Ohio Valley Conference history and has won over 500 Division I basketball games. So he's a great guy, and his wife was here. So he sneaked out before I could introduce him.
That is impressive. Winning is one thing, longevity in coaching is another.
Yeah, you have to do both.
It's hard. You have to do both. You don't get one without the other.
And graduate your players.
And graduate players.
Give this back to you in case you need it.
Okay, yeah, I think we'll be fine. I'm honored to be joined on our second panel by the Honorable Dr. David Shulkin, Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Secretary Shulkin is accompanied today by Dr. Carol Clancy, the Executive in charge of the Veterans Health Administration, and Dr. Laurie Zephyrin, the Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Health and Community Care. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us this morning. At your request, we're going to provide a few additional minutes for you to present your testimony. You're now recognized for as much time as you may consume.
Great. Well, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Walz, and distinguished members of the committee, good morning to everybody. Mr. Chairman, first let me express my deep thanks to you and the entire committee for your hard work on community care issues. And thanks for including the VA's Coordinated Access and Rewarding Experiences Bill, what I'm going to refer to as the Veterans Care Act from now on. The work that all of you have done on accountability, on the GI Bill enhancements, on appeals modernization, shows that we can work together in a bipartisan way to make dramatic improvements in VA healthcare and VA services. And I would agree with you, Ranking Member Walz, that this is the example of committees in Congress. I tell people we have the best leadership and the best committees in both the House and the Congress anywhere, that I'm very, very proud of the work that all of you do, so thank you. The Veterans Care Bill reflects our overarching veteran-centric effort that's been driving our transparency initiatives. So you may have seen that we're now posting wait times publicly, we're posting our quality data publicly, we're posting our veteran satisfaction data publicly, and all that's about empowering veterans with the information they need to make the best healthcare choices. And most importantly, it's representative of what the private sector has been doing to improve healthcare over the past decade. The Veterans Care Bill leaves behind the old days when administrative needs, not the veterans' needs, governed decisions. It's about individualized care, convenient care, well-coordinated health care designed for a positive experience. The VA will take back customer service and treat veterans as valued customers. Veterans Care ensures the veterans get the right care at the right time with the right provider. It's a system that's driven by good clinical decisions rather than administrative rules, where clinical assessment determines what the veteran needs. That's a VA primary care provider, a VA specialist, or a primary care provider or specialist in the community. If the community care is the answer, the veteran chooses from our integrated high-performance network. And if VA doesn't offer the necessary service, if VA can't provide timely services, if there are unusual burdens to receiving care, or if the service at the VA isn't meeting quality metrics compared to the community, we'll look towards the community while working hard to improve these services within VA. Under veteran care eligibility, criteria will align closely with TRICARE and private sector criteria. And let me just say that we're working closer and better with the Department of Defense than ever before. This plan builds off coordination with the Department of Defense, other federal agencies, and our community partners. Under the Veteran Care Act, veterans will have new access to a network of walk-in clinics for occasional needs such as minor illnesses and injuries. Under Veterans Care, we're proposing consolidating choice and all VA's community care programs into a single program. Under the Veteran Care Act, we will make sure the community providers have patient records and will get the records from veterans back. Veterans Care is a new path that gives veterans more to say in their health care and makes the program work like it should. It's a new direction for VA, where VA is accountable for its own performance, In my opinion, that's going to mean sustained improvements and modernization in this vital resource. In short, it brings VA healthcare into the 21st century and in line with industry best practices. But the Veteran Care Bill is more than purchasing care outside of VA. Much of the bill aims to strengthen and improve VA healthcare with enhanced telemedicine authorities, as you just discussed, better tools to recruit medical residents and other personnel enhancements, and tools to improve VA's leasing programs and make it easier for VA to enter into shared facility arrangements with its academic partners and the Department of Defense. They all strengthen our capacity to deliver better health care. I know this committee shares that goal. I recognize there's going to be concerns about how we will pay for this new system of care. Over 10 years, the cost will be billions less than maintaining the choice and community care programs that we currently have in place. Savings will come from buying community care smarter and spending less money on administrative processes so we can invest more money in veterans' care. We can achieve savings by focusing on clinically driven care, paying Medicare rates for all community services except in areas with severe provider shortages, reducing administrative burdens, improving internal and external efficiencies in the revenue program to collect more dollars from other health insurance, and using value-based purchasing strategies already proven in the private sector. We're committed to exploring innovative ways to achieve more efficient healthcare delivery, and will seek authorities to test reforms for that purpose. This program will require financial offsets and mandatory spending, and I'm glad to discuss these offsets. Mr. Chairman, there's much to commend in the House discussion draft on community care that you've presented. I think any bill moving forward must allow veterans greater choice in their site of care, simplify veteran eligibility by replacing administrative rules with clinical criteria, add convenient care benefits, set timely payment standards, allow VA to take back customer service, include provider agreements with flexible payment rates that streamline how we pay for care, including care in state veterans' homes, allow VA to record obligations at payment for community care. Without this, it's going to be very challenging for us to calculate financial projections, as we've shown. Permit medical record sharing in the network when needed for veteran care, consolidate all non-VA care into a single program, provide additional tools for VA to expand and fill residency positions, and address clinical staffing shortages by improving VA hiring and retention of staff. We need top quality healthcare professionals to deliver excellent care, and it's a very competitive market. The direct hire authority that you provided in choice funding helped us in hiring network and medical center directors, and I'd like to work with you and the committee to find other ways to address personnel shortages in healthcare. Mr. Chairman, to bring veteran care to veterans in October of 2018, we need to move quickly. We need Congress to pass this legislation before December, as you said, Mr. Chairman, to avoid the program running out of money in the choice program and to give veterans a system that works and that meets or exceeds the best the private sector has to offer. This is about building a VA that veterans choose for their care. We want veterans to choose VA. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I'll now yield myself 5 minutes for questions. And thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Your written testimony notes that the cost of the care proposal are still being discussed with OMB. And what's the status of those discussions, and when do you expect to have more information regarding the bill's budgetary impact?
Well, Mr. Chairman, you're correct. We still are in discussions with OMB. We've presented very detailed descriptions of where we think that these cost savings will come and what the overall cost impact will be. And as I said in my oral testimony, we believe that this program, compared to continuing choice and community care programs as they are, will actually be billions of dollars less over 10 years. The reason for those cost savings are, we believe by recording community care obligations at the time of payment, that's going to save money. When we make it easier to share information with community providers, we're going to avoid duplicative testing and have money savings. we're going to have increased authorities to collect money, to do better in our collections. But mostly it's going to be the decreased administrative costs. The administrative costs associated with the Choice program and its complexity has been extremely high. 13% of all money goes towards administrative costs, and that's not consistent with what the private sector would do. So we want to save on administrative costs and invest that into both the VA system and more care that veterans can receive in the community.
A couple of things that the system that we've put together is really no different than what you see what I personally have, which is a gatekeeper. I have a physician, a primary care doctor that I go to. Depending on what my primary care doctor says, I'll then referred if I need a specialist. That's pretty much what we're saying. If the specialty care can be provided within the VA, it's done so, and if not, referred out. Here's my concern, your proposal was a little light on details, is that what if there's a conflict when the veteran goes in about either specialty care and or primary care? We know that I visited Medford, Washington with Greg Walden, Chairman Walden, about a week ago, and they're short 4 PAC teams there. So if a veteran calls in at Medford, they can't get in because there's no PAC team there. So 2 things. What does that veteran do? And then one, when there is a conflict, if they get in there, how do you get out of the system if you want out? That's choice. So how's that resolved?
Well, there's a lot there, and we've actually worked a lot on these details, so I'm not going to be able to do everything right here, but let me just comment on exactly on what you said. I completely agree. We are trying to model this after the way that you and I have practiced medicine and the way it's practiced across America. Doctors, patients, providers, patients make decisions on what's best for the patient. So that's clinical criteria as opposed to a bunch of rules like 40 miles in 30 days. So we want the rules to go away. We want this to be a clinical decision. What we've learned over the past couple years in VA is, first of all, our top priority is to define the clinical urgency of a problem. That concept was missing a couple years ago in VA when we got into trouble in Phoenix with the wait time crisis. So there will be no issues when patients have clinically urgent needs. And we're also going to add or propose to add this convenience care benefit so that people don't have to drive in hundreds of miles just to get something simple. When it comes to what you're talking about, which is where many people say, look, the VA can provide something within a clinically appropriate time, but I'd rather not wait that long. I'd rather go someplace more convenient. This is where we want to align with the TRICARE eligibility criteria and align with private sector standards. And so we are prepared to sit down and to share some of those eligibility criteria on how we would deal with that, just like any other health system does.
Yes, the other thing is if I get in there and I'm seeing you as my doctor and it's just not working out and there's no other, how is that resolved where that veteran can then get either outside care or if they can't provide a PAC team in there? I think that's critical because we've trapped the veteran in the same system if it didn't work. And so how is that resolved?
What we are signaling in this is beginning to start doing what we should have been doing more, which is giving the veteran more choice in the say of their care. There's no doubt about that. In the private sector, we're seeing more consumer-driven health care, and we need to be moving the same direction. Nobody should feel trapped in the VA system. What you're seeing here is we're saying where the VA is not meeting community quality standards, we want to give veterans more choice. Where the capacity isn't there, like you're talking about, where the PAC teams cannot handle the capacity or the demand, that's where we will give veterans more choice in the community.
Okay. My time has expired. Mr. Waltz, you're recognized.
Well, thank you. Secretary Shulkin, again, thank you. As I said, no one is more accessible. No one is more engaged in talking to folks, and I am grateful. That changes the entire dialogue, helps us be successful. Dr. Zephyrin, thank you for being here and the work you do. And Dr. Clancy, thank you once again. I was just thinking in my head, I think you and I have the most seniority of the people here today. You keep stepping back into the breach, and for that I am grateful. Up in International Falls again, I bring it back because if you want the example of rural, you want the example of people who are committed to this, of trying to get the care. I asked them in a room about 100 veterans and family, how many have used choice? About 30. How many had successful experiences? 2. Didn't change their concept, though, that we needed to make this work. And I think all of us in here, the reason we've been successful is that we've tried to make sure there's not hidden agenda, there's not where it's at. People fear VA is a choice. Being able to get into a VA hospital with a fully staffed staff is a choice with people, too. And every time we say, and we all are up here, and I think we've talked about this before, every time we say it's not privatization, it's the exercise in don't think of a giraffe. That's exactly what they're thinking about. So if the idea is we have to figure this out, emergency funding for choice cannot continue. And that's what we've all talked about. We have to fund this. We have to understand what is the proper balance that's struck between a VA that, as the chairman always said, we've always used care in the community. We've always tried to figure that part out. And I think getting veterans engaged in this, making sure they're very clear about what this is and where these intersect is absolutely critical, because I think most of us agree on principle that getting veterans timely access to health care as near to home as possible in a manner they want, that's what we should do. Trying to match that up, it is no small thing, as we found out when we first did choice. You can't have the concept and not talk about the money. Because when they came back from CBO with $100 billion, a lot of people stepped back and re-looked at this. So with that being said, how does the draft VA proposal and the HVAC proposal align or not align with that request for proposal that was issued last year? How is the alignment happening here, as you see it?
With the proposal last year?
The RFP that was issued December, is that correct?
Oh, yes, yes, okay. Yeah. I think that these are working out very well in terms of the alignment. What we're looking for in revising the approach towards the choice program, what we learned is that VA needs to take back customer service. You can't outsource that. No successful company does that and survives. And we learned that the relationships that we've developed with our veterans over the years is very important to maintain. So the RFP is out there. What that's going to do is to ask for external help in areas that VA does not have expertise. It's network development and maintaining the network, in potentially processing claims and in paying bills and in some of the other administrative areas that we put into the RFP. We believe we're going to have to phase in that RFP over the next year because we can't do everything at once, and we want to do this well. Again, another lesson that we learned from the choice program when we tried to turn it on across the country all at once in 90 days. So I think that this is a well thought out plan, and I think it will all align well.
Okay. I think all of us are trying to get simplicity here. A lot of those failures were complexity. So you talked about consolidating into a single program. A few bills on today's agenda seek to make changes to Veterans Choice. In your opinion, based on the fact the committee is discussing draft legislation to consolidate care, does it make sense to do that in best practices? Because it's well-intentioned, but once again, we're talking about consolidation and streamlining, and we're proposing things to do carve-outs and start different tracks.
Well, there were a lot of really good ideas presented on the first panel, and there's no doubt that everybody is addressing significant issues with the various bills. I think that we'd have to sort of go through them one by one. Some are absolutely essential to do. Our family from Texas, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to take a unrelated or non-veteran donor and be able to help a veteran. That's absolutely clear. Others, I think that what we'd want to do is to make sure that we're not making the program more complex by setting a whole bunch of different rules. But the intents of these programs are all well-designed, focusing on suicide, military sexual trauma, mental health issues, and we want to work with the members in the committee to make sure we can accomplish that.
I appreciate that. I yield back, Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Bilirakis, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for thinking outside the box and putting our veterans first. I really appreciate that so very much, and being so open-minded when it comes to this. Can you speak to how you envision VA assessing and monitoring the quality of care received in the community, and whether you believe community providers should be required to meet or excel the same quality standards VA providers are required to meet? And if so, how would you accomplish that? Is that something the VA can do on its own, or will it require legislation?
Yeah, Congressman, we have a very extensive set of metrics in which to do that. But I have to my left Dr. Clancy, one of the country's experts on this, and it's her area of responsibility, so I'm going to ask her to talk to that.
So it's a very, very important question. The issue of what you can learn about the quality of care in the community is a picture that's changing and growing rapidly because more and more people want to know. If I'm going to seek care from Dr. Hill or Dr. Rowe, how do I know that that is the right provider for me? It's a bit spotty right now, but we are working with private sector partners, and they too are facing increased demands from the private and public sectors to be far more transparent about their care. Right now, the greatest transparency that we see is in cardiology because their professional organization has been building this out for a while. But we will see more and more of that over time. And that becomes a big resource for us to be able to hold ourselves accountable that we are providing care that is at least comparable and hopefully better than that provided in the private sector. But it's also going to be, as Dr. Shulkin just said, a key part of our decision matrix in terms of when are veterans eligible for choice or care in the community.
Thank you. Thank you. Please continue to communicate with us on that issue.
Sure.
Mr. Secretary, Doctor, of course, please respond to concerns that the $2.1 billion Congress provided in August to supplement the CHOICE Act, the fund, will run out before the end of the 6-month period that money was intended to cover. How much money is in the CHOICE Act now? And do you have any concerns that the VA will over-obligate that fund before the end of the year? So we just want to report on what's there.
There were some erroneous reports earlier that we were quickly running out of money on that fund. That is not the case. We do plan on the $2.1 billion lasting till the end of the year. As you know, you authorized this again in August, so we believe we'll get through the end of the calendar year. I think as the chairman said, and I reiterated, we believe there is some urgency to get this done before the December recess so we don't fall into crisis. We are tracking the financial projections on the $2.1 billion, and it's tracking according to plan. We follow it every week. Having said that, this is a very challenging program to do financial projections on. I know it sounds like it should be easy, but when you have to record your payments before, when you have to obligate your funds before you provide the service, it's like looking into a crystal ball and trying to guess what services a veteran will use, and no other private sector company would do that. So that it is very tough for us to do this, but we are doing the best we can, and we think that we're on plan.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Skilled nursing care centers were not included in the CHOICE program as an eligible provider, as you know. Utilizing existing resources like skilled nursing centers could help alleviate access issues for quality care again, in our own communities. Does the VA support provider agreements for skilled nursing centers? And can you explain potential benefits or initial concerns?
Yes, we do support that. Right now, as you know, Medicare reports on the quality of community nursing centers, and many of the most popular or highest quality nursing centers won't deal with the VA because of the complexity of our federal contracting rules and the requirements that we put in place. Provider agreements and being able to do this directly with the skilled nursing facilities with less burdensome contracting rules would help veterans. It would allow us to have access to the best centers that are out there in the community. So we would very much support that.
No, thank you for that input. I appreciate that. Thank you. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Takano, you recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Shulkin, my first questions is about the Veterans Crisis Line. I recently came back from a CODEL to visit deported veterans living in Tijuana, Mexico. I traveled with my fellow committee members, Representatives Correa and Rice, and while there, we learned that veterans abroad can't access the Veterans Crisis Line. We tried calling from several different cell phones and landlines, but couldn't get through. This doesn't just affect deported veterans, it affects any veteran living or traveling abroad who may need immediate access to the VCL. While I understand today's draft legislation, the study of the VCL doesn't focus on veterans abroad, has the VA looked into creating a toll-free line that veterans could call when they are out of the country?
You know, I'll ask the members that are Dr. Clancy and Dr. Zephyrin. I was not aware of that, and I don't see any reason why we wouldn't want to do that. Our goal with the Veterans Crisis Line should be to help anybody who needs help, and I was not aware that you couldn't call from abroad and reach the number. So that is something that I don't think would be technically difficult to do, and we should be able to do that.
I thank you for that answer, Mr. Secretary. And we have many deported veterans who wore the uniform in the United States, some in combat, some even, one veteran is actually at the barracks in Lebanon that was bombed. And I believe veterans like this should be able to get access to that crisis line. What kind of resources or support would the VA need from Congress so that veterans could access the VCL from anywhere in the world?
Well, as I said, I don't see it as a technically difficult process to have. You know, on the back of your credit card, you have one phone number when you're trying to reach it domestically and one internationally. So I think that we should be able to work with our telecommunications provider to set up a toll-free number.
Well, I certainly hope to engage with you on this issue in the further. Secretary Shulkin, two of the draft bills before us today make changes to the VA's graduate medical school education residencies, including the VA's CARE Act. I was thrilled when the Choice Act included 1,500 residency slots to help train and attract doctors to the VA. In part, thanks to Choice, University of California, Riverside School of Medicine in my district has been able to build an academic affiliation with the VA Loma Linda healthcare system to gain residency slots and begin treating veterans in our local CBOCs. I'd like to ask unanimous consent right now to insert into the record a letter from Dr. Deborah Dees, Dean of the UCR Medical School of Medicine, commenting on the current program and the program bills we're discussing
Without
today.
objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dean Dees raises questions about what incentives residents have to enter into the service-obligated residencies in the draft legislation. What incentive is there for veterans to apply for these residencies? And I think that's a concern about whether or not they would apply, anyway.
Well, first of all, thank you for being a consistent champion on this effort. I know that you have strongly supported the expansion of graduate medical education and strengthening people joining VA as a career. This has been my private sector life, working in academic centers and running graduate medical education programs. So I have an opinion on this, and I'm sure the dean does too, and I'd be glad to follow up with her. We are now in a situation where there are more U.S. medical school graduates than residency spots. So it is becoming extremely competitive to get a graduate medical education spot. If the VA expands the number of spots available, I believe these will be highly competitive positions for highly competitive candidates. The best asset that the VA has is its academic partners, thanks to General Bradley in 1946 and his vision of establishing these teaching relationships. So you're going to have the very best medical schools and residency programs in the country expanding spots and medical students deciding whether they want to apply for those spots or not, even if they are tied to giving back service to the VA. So I believe it will be an experiment whether they are competitive. I believe these spots will fill. I believe our academic partners have terrific teaching programs, and people will want to be in those residency spots.
Wonderful. I think the question is whether our most competitive medical students will want those residency slots. But I wish I could ask you a couple more questions, but my time is up, and I'll submit them for the record, and they're related to mainly to the residencies. But thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. General Bergman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Walz, and Dr. Shulkin. It's always good to see you, and Dr. Clancy and Dr. Zephyrin here. I know you appear before us quite regularly. Dr. Shulkin, you mentioned earlier that VA must take back customer service. Does that mean that the VA will be moving towards, shall we say, reducing third-party contracts, which naturally create a, if you will, a disconnect between the VA and the veteran?
Yes, I think that is exactly what it means. And Dr. Zephyrin, maybe you want to expand on that.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for your question. So by taking back the administrative services and really connecting with the veteran directly is going to be critical. When we talked with our veteran stakeholders, when we talked with community providers, when we talked with our staff at the medical centers, that was the area that was most lacking in choice. And so with our new CCN, we'll actually be taking back scheduling, taking back communication with the veteran, and really the veteran will really, and also taking back care coordination as well, so that we are interfacing with veterans directly.
Okay, thank you. Also, I have this was a news release dated July 7th, 2016, about VA conducts nation's largest analysis of veteran suicide. You know, we've talked a little bit before about those 20-some veterans a day, and the breakdown of as I look at the numbers here, the question still is a little bit unanswered in my mind of those veterans, especially in the OIF, OEF, who have actually been in the fight. Because we know that in an all-recruited force that we have, not an all-volunteer force in this country, an all-recruited force, that the demographics of those young men and women who join and you know, swear to an oath to support and defend the Constitution, that doesn't necessarily reflect a cross-section of the age-eligible people in our society. Further take that into that subcategory of those who did sign, those who did complete training, those who did deploy, but those who deployed, let's say, into areas that didn't put them out on combat patrols, in combat convoys, and different things that are those natural mental stressors. I'm still looking for is how we the VA in conjunction with DOD continue to dissect the relevant data to see where the stressors are. And I mean, if you have any comments, anybody, I'd like to hear them.
Our data analysis capabilities have been limited. We are able to identify those that are deployed out of country. And so we do some analyses that way, but we have not been able to do the finer analyses that you're talking about what type of conflict and what their duties have been. We continue to work with the Department of Defense on that. What we do know, and I'm sure you're aware, that there are clusters of suicides that come out of specific units, and they may be exactly the types of factors that you're talking about. And so we are working with particularly the Marines in some of the recent clusters of suicides to try to dissect that and understand that further.
Yeah. Well, it's relevant and essential that we don't create support structures that don't hit the target, if you will, because the goal is to help our veterans work through those naturally difficult and stressful times that life gives all of us, work them through the rough spots, and a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach does not work. And thank you for continuing to lead and to make those tough decisions as only a secretary of a department gets to do. So thank you for continuing to do that, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your continued service to our nation's veterans. I wanted to ask a question relative to telemedicine. You heard our discussion earlier, and I am very, very interested in breaking down barriers so that telemedicine certainly can be utilized for our veteran community. And Representative Thompson and I have worked on the Vets Act bill, and I can assure you it's taken almost a year to get consensus, really, from all of the stakeholders, internally and externally, to get consensus around this bill. And then I've noticed that in your proposal that you have chosen different language around telemedicine. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, why and for what purpose your approach is.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for leading this, and this is very important. As you know, VA is already the largest provider of telehealth services, but those barriers that you have identified are real, and we want to get them addressed. I am not aware of any meaningful differences between what you're trying to do and what we're trying to do. We very much support your bill, and I'd be glad to go back and understand why there are language differences, but your bill, I think, hits exactly what we want to do. The one area that I know that we were concerned with and that some of our stakeholders or outside stakeholders were concerned with is that we were only seeking authorities for VA employees and VA clinicians and not trying to expand this beyond into the community providers, which I think is a whole different set of issues. So, but I looked at your bill and I don't see any problems with it.
Well, I'm happy to hear that answer. I think our interpretation of the language in your proposal would expand the use of telemedicine, which I think in the future we want to get there, but it basically, the way I understand it, it would include contracting authority or other community care options, which is taking those community clinicians and saying, yes, you can use telemedicine too. And I think there's obviously the stakeholders and so forth involved in this are very worried about liability issues and other kinds of things, and certainly liability from the VA if this was extended that way. So I think that's where the rub is, so to speak. So I certainly would like to pursue further the conversation. Another question are really around choke points in the system, and I think back in March, the GA testimony laid out a lot of different choke points. The VA preparing and sending the veterans clinical files, or the contractors waiting 10 days to hear back from the veteran. So I'm wondering from you and the VA perspective on how you're going to address some of these choke points.
Yeah, I mean, I invite either of you to join in on this. Many of these choke points are related to the administrative complexity of running multiple programs. As you know, we have 7 different ways of choosing how we pay for community care. We don't seem to get exactly the spending rate out of each of the buckets to align all the time, which is the difficulty with our financial projections. But what we want to do is to simplify this, to take some of the red tape out, to put veterans more in control of their decision-making. In many cases, take having to do unnecessary steps and multiple calls completely out of the way. I think that will eliminate many of the choke points, probably not all of them, and we're going to continue to have to work at the system until we can get it so it's completely user-friendly. But I think what we're proposing is a big step forward.
Thank you. And just lastly, I only have a few more seconds left. I think, you know, healthcare or health record interoperability is going to be, you know, a big savior to all of this. But I guess I would just like to hear your perspective on the feasibility and the timing. I mean, when do you really, and I really want an honest answer here, when do you really think we will have true interoperability?
30 seconds or less.
Okay. We've given Congress a 30-day notification of our intent to negotiate a contract that would give us the true interoperability with the Department of Defense. We released last week in the Federal Register an RFI for industry to help us with interoperability for community providers. This is a total package where that's what we seek, real and full true interoperability for veterans.
Thank you. I apologize. I yield.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. 4.5 minutes next time around. No. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member for the leadership in drafting this choice legislation that would better serve our veterans. And Mr. Secretary, I thank you for your continued dedication towards the same cause. The newly established coordination between the DOD and the VA is long overdue, and it's just great to hear as a veteran. And I believe this will help ensure, you know, seamless transition for our veterans. It's just common sense approach, which the bipartisan nature of this committee and your own dedicated efforts certainly reflect a common sense approach that we're all looking for. I was pleased to see that the VA included in its draft care legislation provisions allowing for the certain use of urgent care or walk-in medical facilities. Would you please speak to how you and the VA envision the use of urgent care facilities for our veterans?
Yeah. This would be an added new benefit. We think having a veteran have to drive 100 miles to get a lab test or a flu shot or something simple for a minor illness just doesn't make sense. It's not good for veterans. So we would add a benefit. A national network of urgent care would be developed by our third party. We would allow veterans 2 visits a year under essentially their current structure, which would be no payment for service-connected veterans and a small copay that currently exists for non-service-connected veterans. After 2 visits a year, there would be a additional or a copay that would be required so that we could control the cost of a new benefit, but still allow veterans to have access to these services in their community.
And this would, in its very nature, expand the choice available to our veterans. And there's a large difference between driving 5 blocks to have a sprained ankle treated or driving 50 miles or 100 miles and waiting 9 hours to get the same treatment.
Exactly. Yep, this doesn't exist today, so it would be a new benefit.
Yeah, a reasonable copay is certainly something that most veterans would not argue about. I was also pleased to see the VA included provisions to enable medical facility sharing with other departments, as well as expanded and enhanced use lease authority. Could you please elaborate on the VA's future vision for facility sharing and extended use leases, sir?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right, Congressman, that there's never been a closer relationship and better working relationship with the Department of Defense. And I have to thank Secretary Mattis for that spirit of cooperation. We now have discussions going on all over the country about where the Department of Defense has excess capacity and where we have veterans that need care and services and vice versa. And so we are working to figure out what makes sense for veterans, active service members, and the taxpayers, and coming up with a number of different plans and facilities. And so what you're going to see, I think we're asking for some ability, even in this legislation, to avoid having to exchange bills. You know, we're probably spending more on administrative costs than we are on taking care of, you know, our veterans in this case. So we want to try to decrease some of the barriers and regulations to doing more of this work together.
Thank you, sir, for your answers, and I again commend you and your staff for working tirelessly as we endeavor to reform the VA and provide greater service for our veterans that certainly deserve it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ms. Custer, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Shulkin, for being with us. I want to first thank you publicly for your prompt response and support in New Hampshire to the problems that we're having at the Manchester VA and the changes that you're making to the administration there, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. And in particular, the task force that's looking into how to restructure availability of access to health care for every veteran within the state of New Hampshire. So along those lines, how will the VA consider geographic, seasonal, and other issues around eligibility? And in particular, can you comment on the reasonable distance standard? In New Hampshire, we don't have a full-service VA hospital, and people have to travel long distances in the mountains and the snow. How will these decisions be made? Is it a case-by-case basis? Is it subjective? Or are there guidelines?
Yeah. Great questions, and I think the chairman was referring to this as well, where he said the details are very important in this. The short answer is that we want this done on clinical criteria. So we want a provider and a patient making the best decision for the patient. When it comes to New Hampshire, neurosurgery, as long as it's not urgent or emergent, we do believe will still be referred to regional providers, maybe in the case of New Hampshire, continue to flow into Boston. But we don't believe that you should have strict mileage criteria or wait time criteria, because there are patients that, frankly, are not able to get into VAs who may live 20 miles away, where it's best for them to get care in the community. So this 40-mile standard just isn't what's best for them. There are others that may live 45 miles away, but getting into a regional medical center is not a problem. So these are going to be individual clinical decisions and based on feasibility and access, and a drive time in the West may be easier to get to in a certain amount of mileage than it would be in a more congested area.
Okay, thank you. Another question about your VA CARES proposal. You include innovative pilot programs, and I wanted to ask if you have ever considered, in your proposal, you include them between Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs. I have legislation to establish pilot programs to coordinate healthcare resources with other providers, including specifically federally qualified health centers. And I just wonder if you have thought about that. For example, in my rural district, that's where the veterans frequently get their health care. It's a comprehensive health care with dental and eye care and podiatry, which I know is has a big, long wait list at the VA. Have you considered that, and would you consider a pilot project?
Well, as Congressman Higgins said, we have included the piece about the Department of Defense. But frankly, it just makes sense to do this with all federal agencies. Federally qualified health centers, absolutely. Indian Health Service, absolutely. We just announced the first time a relationship with the Public Health Service, so Public Health Service officers can begin to serve in the VA. So 100% we believe this is good for veterans and good for taxpayers, and we want to pursue that. In addition, we want to pursue the things that we know the private sector has already shown make sense. Our current system allows us to pay a Medicare fee schedule, flat. That's not happening anymore in the private sector. I used to run a very large accountable care organization. We know these work. We know that value-based purchasing works, differential payments. We want those same systems for the VA, and we want that authority and flexibility to test these out.
Good, thank you. And just very briefly at the end, there's VACA, the 2014 bill had 1,500 positions for graduate medical education residency. Have those all been used? And why not just increase that program? Why do you start over with a new program?
Thank you for this question. I wanted to try to get this with Representative Kono, but I didn't have time. So you gave us 1,500 positions. We've only used 750 of them. And the reason is that the program, the way it was designed, well-intentioned for all the right reasons, we learned some challenges over these last 3 years. The first is that we're only allowed to pay for the time the resident is in the VA. So the academic partners have to come up with their own money to at least match that, and they're capped out at the Medicare rate. So that's essentially one of the big problems. So the other problem is that as we train more residents, they don't necessarily come back to the VA. We're training them and they're going out into the community, which is fine. It doesn't necessarily help VA. So what we're proposing is to do this smarter. Allow the VA to pay for the entire cost of the resident. That way academic programs are going to want to train more residents because that's what they do and that's what they do well. But tie it back to a service component back into the VA. So it's what we've learned over the last 3 years, why we've only used half the spots you gave us. We'd like to suspend that program and invest that money back into a new, better designed program.
Thank you, and I'm well over my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield
Dr.
back.
Dunn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me echo the comments that have been made by Ranking Member Walz and others that you have made yourself very available to this committee, and that's a breath of fresh air, and also you're a great partner, you and your professionals. Thank you so much. So I want to address the VICTOR Act. That's one of the two organ transplant bills that are sitting before us. And I know, with your background, you understand the barriers that time and distance impose, specifically on transplant medicine. How do you suggest that we can better meet the specialized needs of the transplant patients in a consolidated community care program?
Right. Well, first of all, I've already indicated my strong support for allowing us to be able to access non-veteran donors. And I think that the way that you presented your testimony today just makes a great deal of sense. You want what's best for veterans, and you know that getting organs and getting it done well is a challenging program anywhere in the country. So what I think we want to try to come out of this with, and hopefully to work closely with you to do this, is to make sure that veterans that need access to organs have the best available access. And in particularly cases of urgent transplantation, we do want the ability to use community programs. But we also want to make sure that we maintain the strength of the transplant programs in the VA. So it's this balance between making sure that the 14 sites or 21 different transplant programs that we have are strengthened and supported, and at the same time making sure that veterans who need access to those community programs have them.
Thank you. Can you compare the costs of delivering just say a liver transplant in the VA transplant centers compared to a civilian center?
Well, our transplant programs do many things. They care for pre-transplant workups and post-transplant workups. So when you take a look at the entire package of these 21 different transplant programs at 14 sites, we think that they are less costly than the private sector alternative. When we send patients out through the choice program for transplants, we pay the Medicare fee schedule. it is very challenging to get a private sector hospital to accept the Medicare fee schedule rate for transplantation. So that what we're seeing is that the costs in the private sector can be, in some cases, higher. Now, quality is what makes the biggest difference, because you don't want to have to retransplant an organ. That's where it can get really costly.
So if I could just make a comment to your answer, which is the other transplant bill, Judge Carter's bill, which was the living-related donors being covered in the VA, is a great answer for keeping your VA centers busy and actually, as you say, trained and up to snuff. That's a beautiful dovetail there of those two. It's fair to say, listening sort of in between the lines here, that there's no clinical purpose that's served by requiring veterans, per se, to be driving past these other centers to get to VA centers.
Right.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman, Mr. O'Rourke, recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Shulkin, I first want to begin by, again, thanking you for your service and commending the administration for nominating you and the Senate for confirming you. We are grateful for your responsiveness and the work that you and your team are doing. I want to make sure, though, that I don't let you off the hook. Ms. Brownlee asked you a very good question, and you didn't answer it. She asked you how long it would take to get an electronic health record system going, true interoperability with Department of Defense, and much of your plan is predicated on ensuring that we confidentially and yet effectively share private patient health record information with providers in the community. How long for us to be able to implement that effectively 100%?
Well, thank you for holding me accountable, but I was sensitive to her time that was running out.
Don't use too much of mine, because I have other questions.
The answer is, once we negotiate the contract, it will be 18 months from the time that the contract is complete to the first site in VA going up.
How about, to fully answer my question, to get to 100%?
We are thinking 7 to 8 years.
Okay. It's good for us to know and to be aware of as we think about implementing this, that we're looking at 7 to 8 years. And this is not a scientific analysis, but I have yet to see a VA budget for time or cost exceeded. It usually goes beyond the budgeted time, beyond the budgeted cost. So I think that's important for us.
This is a new VA, Congressman.
Well, I'm encouraged by what you've done so far, but I want to make sure that we're going into this eyes wide open. Yeah. You've seen a number of proposals to reduce veteran suicide, many just here today. You know that Representative Kaufman has been an exceptional leader on this committee on this. We were able to join him on a proposal to reduce suicides from those veterans who have an other than honorable discharge. You've told me you're doing everything you can to your administrative capacity to admit people on an emergency basis. For those OTH veterans who are precluded from getting care now, we are dependent on the bill that we passed out of this committee and I believe has been passed in the Senate from getting to the floor, and I want to work with Chairman Rowe and the administration to make sure that it's got the political push to get that done. I think that's going to make a huge difference. I want to ask you, using an example in El Paso, how you can both now administratively meet the crisis, and two, how you will be able to do that through your proposed legislation. While we have seen the number of total health care providers delivering mental health care in El Paso increase from 68 providers to 112 today, we just got the third quarter sale data, and we see a drop of 222% in continuity of care for mental health care provision. I can only imagine what that means for the veterans who have been trying to receive that care. I want to know how you're going to meet that challenge in El Paso and in VA medical centers and clinics around the country, because I think it's directly connected to ensuring that more veterans live and do not take their own lives. And two, and I think this is related, how you are going to better focus on hiring and retaining the best primary care providers. We have a real crisis in El Paso, and from traveling Texas, I'm hearing it in community after community, people unable to get to see a primary care provider or losing that primary care provider, not having a replacement. So asked you a bunch. We've got a minute and a half left. I'll let you answer.
And you're going to make sure I answer them all.
Okay, thanks.
Very, very quickly, look, our top clinical priority is suicide. we also are very grateful to Representative Kaufman for his leadership on Other Than Honorable. We took some initial steps. We think that working with you, we need to go much further. You're going to hear some announcements for us in the month of November. We're going to take some additional, very big, bold steps to address the transition problem, addressing suicide with active service members coming out of the Department of Defense. We're working with the Department of Defense on that now. We are working on new innovative ways to address the mental health issue. We're looking at new ways of using telehealth to get more access for mental health, some ideas that we haven't yet shared with you, but we're working on right now. We need your help on hiring and retention. As you know, I am not very happy that our retention and recruitment dollars were cut in half to pay for the CARA Act. I've asked for the authority to spend more on retention and recruitment without any additional dollars to the budget. I want the flexibility to put money towards paying our providers more and providing retention and recruitment bonuses where we're needed. We need greater direct hire authority on those mental health workers that are now Title V or Title 38 hybrids, such as psychologists and licensed social workers. It is too hard to get them hired, and we need that. We need it from you. Just put it into the bill, direct hire authority for mental health professionals, and that would be a great help to us. We essentially are trying to hire 1,000 more mental health professionals. Over this past year, we went backwards by 45. We hired 900, but we lost 945. So we need to do more, and primary care doctors are challenging as well. So we'd love to work with you on additional help.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, for the additional time.
I think that's something we can put in the bill. I have no objection to that at all. Dr. Winster. Wagon. To recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and for holding this hearing today. And I also want to thank Secretary Shulkin and the rest of the witnesses for their testimony. As you know, Secretary Shulkin, one of the challenges veterans in remote areas like the U.S. territories face is a lack of access to care. Not only do they find themselves traveling ludicrous distances to receive VA care, but often the local community is also lacking sufficient health care facilities to meet their needs closer to home. Even if this very important legislation passes and veterans are able to take advantage of community care, little will change if there's no accessible care in their communities in the first place. I have a few questions. I'm going to put them all out there. Yeah. Mr. Secretary, your draft legislation would allow the VA to coordinate and share resources with other federal agencies for the purposes of developing shared medical facilities. How can this be used for the benefit of our veterans in remote areas? Will this bill allow VA to develop or build upon medical facilities in the territories that meet care standards and allow our veterans to receive care close to home? Another proposed solution to provide care for veterans in remote areas is the use of telehealth, as was mentioned, something we're addressing today with Representative Thompson and Brownlee's bill, H.R. 2123. Mr. Secretary, VFW's written statement alleges that some VA providers are actually reluctant to provide telemedicine across state lines under the authority granted by an executive order. Similarly, AFGE's written statement for the record alleges that VA providers have serious concerns about risks to their state medical licenses, even if such authority were granted via legislation, and have received no assurances that VA would offer assistance to them if state licensing boards pursue disciplinary actions against them for violating state licensing requirements. Would you please respond to those allegations?
Well, thank you for continuing to keep at this issue of providing our veterans in remote areas access. It's extremely important. These aren't easy answers, else we would have probably done it already, but we're as committed as you are to finding solutions. So working with the other federal facilities, as Congressman Custer had mentioned, absolutely we need to do that, and we are doing that with the Department of Defense and other federal agencies. On telehealth, I can't give a stronger assurance to our providers that that they absolutely will be protected using these telehealth authorities. We have the Department of Justice that has agreed to do that. I practice from here in Washington to Oregon. I do not have an Oregon license. I have a Pennsylvania license and a New York license. So they can see me doing it, and I want them to feel assured that they can and should be using their medical capabilities to help veterans in remote areas using telehealth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thanks, General Lady, for yielding. We've Dr. Shulkin and I came a long way before. We used telephones to do health care, and we've done that for a long time, and we need to clear up, because we're going to have to clear up how Medicare compensates. That's a different discussion, and I think Ms. Brownlee's bill with G.T. Thompson, Congressman Thompson, really narrows the focus to the VA, and that's a great pilot program, I think, for the country to try it and see how it works. Totally agree with that. Ms. Esty, you recognized.
Health issues, and in particular on the issue about military suicide prevention, which remains, and I think you were properly noted, as your #1 clinical and, in fact, sole clinical priority. I was reminded of this in a conversation with a family last week who, a year ago, their son was in crisis and wound up with a standoff with a SWAT team. They tried calling the crisis line and found it not at all helpful. Fortunately, the situation was resolved with a friend who was a veteran who was able to get into the house and help. But that was last year. So we need to hear from you. I know you're committed to this. What resources you need, what training is necessary, because frankly, we were just fortunate that a friend was able to get there in time. So please know how committed we are to providing you the resources, but it is not just numbers of people on the phone. It's the quality of what they receive. And in that crisis situation, it just, fortunately, we were able to get a live person there in time, but it was a reminder of that challenge. I wanted to follow up with your conversation with Congressman O'Rourke about retention and recruiting and retention of mental health professionals. I have a brother-in-law who worked a long time doing VA psychiatric work and found it very frustrating. He felt he did not have the time or support to do anything other than write scripts. Now, that was in Southern California, and I do not think his experience was unique. So that may not only be direct hires, but that is about how their time is accounted, what directions they are given, and latitude they are given to practice medicine as licensed psychiatrists. So I would ask you to work with us and provide the resources you need to do that. It's not, again, it's not just having the bodies. Mm-hmm. It's a special population. So when we're losing ground, you're losing talent, yes, you're losing experience. And so, again, that in looking to recruit, I think that retention issue, and I don't know what you're doing. Are you systematically interviewing people who are leaving to find out what their reasons are? Is it money? Is it, my guess is it probably has more to do with conditions in which they're practicing. Would you care to comment?
Well, I'm gonna rely upon my 25 years of private sector experience as well. #1 reason why people leave their jobs is usually not money, so you're correct. It's usually the relationship with their boss and whether they believe that they're valued and they're heard. And too often, I think that we have not paid enough attention to the management structure and have the right people leading our clinicians. So that is a focus of ours. Burnout among healthcare professionals in general is huge. We've had a dedicated effort to reducing burnout. We've reduced the number of alert notifications on our computers. And in fact, burnout is actually better, if you can be better in burnout, than in the private sector, where the billing and productivity and financial pressures are much larger than you even see in the VA. But these are real issues, so I think your insights are right, and we're trying to focus on it. We have a lot of work to do.
You mentioned needing to have congressional direct authority to do direct hires. Are there other elements that you need us to take action on to facilitate this critical need now to recruit and retain the best mental health professionals to deal with this cherished population who have served this country, who we owe this more than anything?
I would love to see a comprehensive hiring and retention act for VA. We have met last week with OPM. We've asked them for a number of waivers. They seem willing to do this, but we haven't gotten the final responses from them. We know that, that it just takes too long to hire people into the VA. We know that in many cases in Southern California, maybe it's not just Southern California, but that would be an example, our pay caps for nurses are now $20,000 to $30,000 below. Our caps between what starting salaries are in the private sector. We've asked for some consideration of that as well. So we would love to work with you on a comprehensive hiring and retention authorities.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that, and because I think we really do want to get this right, but we need guidance from you about what are the stumbling blocks that you're facing right now in doing this. Thank you, and I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us today. It's always a pleasure, and I mean that sincerely. You know, everyone who is a veteran at one time wore the uniform. That is a given for everyone who's a veteran. And there's a transition, and you mentioned some interactions with DOD, and my feeling is that we should have more interactions with DOD, which I know you're working on from the medical record on down. And I think that's important. Post-traumatic stress, to me, is normal. Having served, it is a normal thing to reflect on where you have been and what you have done. Now, I deployed at 46 years old, and I think that's a big difference between 19 years old. And as a doctor, I'd seen trauma, et cetera, so it was a little bit different as you come back. When you come back as a reservist, for example, they say, oh, you have 90 days before you go back to work. And I said, I'm going next week. And part of that is because I was in a job where I was very necessary, and the last thing I wanted to do was come home and be unnecessary. And I think that's what we face today. We talk about suicide prevention. You know, I feel for the VA because the VA only gets to be reactive. They don't get to be proactive because the proactive component needs to come when you're still in uniform. And as we know, most of the suicides don't occur when you're in uniform. And I would contend that's because you are still necessary. And I would like you to weigh in with me on this because I feel, serving on both Armed Services and VA, we need to do a better job in uniform. That, you know what, when you sign up to serve your country, there's a success at the end of that. And we need to be more proactive on the uniform side, that when you take that uniform off, you know where you're going to school, you're going to use your GI Bill, you know what you're going to major in because it leads to a job, or you're going to a job. And we need to do a better job on that end. We talk a lot about suicide prevention. I think we can do a lot more if we are proactive. And so amongst the mental health providers, I'm wondering if they're coming to any kind of consensus in that arena to say, I'm getting them too late.
I don't think we could say it better than you did. I think you're exactly on target with that.
So hopefully we can engage, and I'll be more than happy to reach out, serving on both committees to try and make those connections. And we have a few members like Mr. O'Rourke that serve in the same capacity, and I know it's a point of passion for him as well. But I would like to get some feedback from the mental health providers that you have to get their opinion on what we can do on the front end to try and be more helpful to the VA ultimately.
There is no doubt that I think you've hit the most important part of why being in service, when you talk to veterans that are struggling the most, and, you know, there's a great film coming out soon called Thank You for Your Service, which really highlights many of the things you're saying. And many people struggling say, if I could go back, I'd go back because I knew I belonged. I felt like I was contributing. And they miss that when they transition out.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you further on that. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ms. Rice, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to kind of continue along Dr. Wenstrup's questioning, it seems, first of all, thank you, Dr. Shulkin, for being so focused on the mental health of our veterans. From what I've heard, it sounds like there is a focus on addressing their particular needs. But the statistic that keeps coming back to me is if you take the number of 20 service members killing themselves a day, and I think the number is 16 of them were not accessing their benefits through the VA, or 14. So I guess my question is, you can do telehealth, you can increase community care, you can do all of that, but if you can't identify these people before they separate, it's a lost cause. So in any of this plan, do you have a thought process about how we can engage veterans before they separate? And I'm glad to hear that, you know, there's a lot more coordination between the VA and DOD, because that was where a lot of people fell through the cracks during their separation process. But how, can you just, you know, expound on that?
Well, two things, and Dr. Clancy, I'd invite if you want to add anything. First of all, within, by the end of November, we will be announcing a new plan with the DOD to work exactly on that issue of the transitioning service member. We know that there is a very high risk or a higher risk of suicide in the first 12 months after leaving service. So that's what we're trying to address. And we're fortunate. We now have Dr. Keita Franklin, who had headed up the Suicide Prevention Office at the Department of Defense, now detailed over to VA. So that's one of these reasons you're seeing a much closer working relationship than ever before between these two agencies to deal with this transitioning issue. Secondly, you're also going to see this next month a public service announcement come out with Tom Hanks talking about how do we reach out to those 14 service members, and what do you do as a member of the community to help identify those 14 veterans that aren't getting access to services at all the right times. So those are two important things. Dr. Clancy?
Thank you. Of the 14 veterans who are not using our system now, some of them will have recently transitioned, and we're very, very excited about working more closely with Defense in this area. But the largest proportion is actually in veterans over 55. Right. And so we've got to figure out ways to reach out to those particular individuals, some of whom may be quite isolated, which may in fact be a big part of the underlying issue. To that end, I serve as the public sector co-chair on a national alliance focused on suicide prevention. You know, my private sector co-chair is from the railroads, because on average they have one person a day suicide by lying on tracks and so forth. This is really a broad U.S. public health emergency, so we're trying to exploit all of those levers as well and reach those who are not plugged into other obvious sources from our system to VSOs or whatnot.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you so much for coming to New York and visiting our VA in Northport. That just, I can't tell you what it did for morale there, and it was a great visit, and I thank you for your time. So my question to you, Mr. Secretary, is with the focus on doing more care in the community and putting more financial resources there, I can tell you that whenever we ask our veterans, raise your hand if you like the service that you get at the VA in Northport, the majority of the people say, yes, I like it. That's not to say that at some point they wouldn't go outside of it, but I guess my question is, So how do I assure those veterans that this push to doing more care in the community, which I support and I think they want, is not going to mean taking resources away from their VA that they feel very committed to? And I also want to thank you for your commitment to realigning a lot of the bills. I mean, Northport in some ways is falling apart and needs massive money, but that might not necessarily be, you know, it has buildings that need to be taken down. But their concern is the VA may have problems, but it's my VA, and I like the VA, and I want to make sure that it's not going to be sacrificed for more care in the community.
Well, it's one of the things, finding the way to strengthen the VA at the same time to make sure that we're meeting the current needs of veterans is really exactly what I'm focused on, and I know it's one of the things that works well about both the House and the Senate. When you take a look at the bill that was just passed, the choice extension in August, it did exactly that. It gave resources to allow veterans to go out into the community, but it also invested more resources into the VA, 28 new leases authorized by you to allow us to do that. The President's budget, while it provides more money for community care, provides an even greater amount for investment back in the VA. So I would assure your constituents, your veterans, that that is our focus. Strengthen the VA, but at the same time, make sure that veterans aren't waiting while we're strengthening the VA so that they can get care in the community.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And as my trip up there, I said, look, there are a lot of strengths here, and you have 5 CBOCs out here that could be strengthened. And taking the care, what we're doing is taking the care as we are everywhere, away from big hospital systems where you got to go in and get lost, and take the care to the veteran, which is the CBOC. Puts it right in their community, it's close by, and they really like that. So I think that's one of the things you can do there. Mr. Coffin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Shulkin, the draft legislation for VA care in the community program broadly provides that the DOD would be an eligible provider for community care. First of all, and then I think you talk about a 2-year pilot program for that. Why is a pilot program necessary, number one? Number two, to what extent have you worked with the Department of Defense on this?
Well, the pilot program would be to avoid having to spend a lot of administrative time billing each other. And right now, I think at the end of last year, the difference between what VA and DOD owed each other was like $30 million. And we figured it cost us $40 million to bill that. Just, you know, the DOD is not set up for billing commercial insurance, so the greater requirements are on their end. So we're trying to simplify this process. The reason for a pilot would be to make sure it doesn't get too imbalanced, because they have an appropriation for health and we have an appropriation for health, and we don't want it to fall the burden too much on each other. I happen to think it's going to equal out, you know, that the amount that we'll use DOD and vice versa will be relatively a wash, and that's why I think we could save the taxpayers money by not billing each other.
Okay. So you envision then that U.S. military personnel, active duty personnel, and their families would then utilize the VA system?
Yes, yes, and they do, and we charge them for it, and we send veterans to DOD facilities, and they charge us for it, and so the pilot would be, let's take down some of the administrative burdens and let's see what happens.
Okay, but I think it's fairly limited right now where you're serving military personnel and their families, is it not?
Yeah, and we wouldn't expand. The pilot would not be expanding the eligibility criteria. The pilot would say, where there are areas where we're working closer together, let's make it easier to work closer together and save the taxpayers some dollars.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because I think that there's no question that we have to work to make the VA better, and we've done some things in this committee, like reforming the personnel system, although I think we probably have a little further to go with that. But you really have two very different systems culturally. The active duty military is a solid merit-based system, and you have a unionized workforce in the VA system, albeit somewhat reformed with recent legislation. But so I do have, and we've had patient safety concerns. I'm sure we've had them in DOD, but we've had some fairly significant patient safety concerns in the VA, and we really need to get those cleared up when you're talking about the families of our military personnel. I wouldn't want them concerned about the patient safety issues. We have to clean them up for our veterans, but until we do, I don't want to increase the patient load there.
Yeah.
We clearly have excess capacity on the military side, simply because of the fact that our operational tempo is down right now relative to what it's been. But it could certainly plus up again, where we have a casualty flow much greater than it is today. And so that's going to really vary in terms of the military, the Department of Defense's ability to handle patients from the VA. But I think it's positive for them to do it on the VA, on the DoD side, because we have so many providers, quite frankly, that because of the fact that the casualty flow is down, that aren't getting experience now. We're trying to get them in ER for trauma, but doing surgery is doing surgery. And so if we can get VA patients in there, particularly those that are service-connected first in terms of priority, I think that would be very helpful.
Yes.
Okay. And again, and on the mental health issue, I just want to say that I get that you're doing a lot of things administratively, but we want to set a policy that's permanently in motion beyond this administration. And so it's important for you to have authorizing language to be able to do that. And therein lies the legislation that I've done with Representative O'Rourke on allowing other than honorable discharge military personnel, veterans, to be able to have access to mental health care.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. Mr. Pollock, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and thank you, Dr. Shulkin, for being here, and your other great staff. We really appreciate it. Mr. Secretary, you've been to Northern Maine a couple of years ago when we first met, and we really appreciate that. And I just want to make sure I make this statement clear to everybody who's paying attention to this hearing, is that the Choice Act, or the Choice Program, or Choice 2.0, whatever you're going to be calling it going forward, Mr. Secretary, is in no way intended to replace the VA. It's just not. Veterans love serving time with veterans. They love healing with veterans. They heal better with veterans. So I get this, and I think everybody on the committee does. However, there are opportunities where it makes so much sense, so much Maine common sense, to be able to receive your health care closer to home. For example, the 2nd District of Maine is not the Portland area, the southern coast area, but it's everything else in Maine. It's highly rural, the most rural district east of the Mississippi River, and it's about an 8-hour drive from one point to the other. So where you went, Dr. Shulkin, up in Caribou, it's a little bit of a drive to Togus, our only VA hospital in the state, the first in the country, I might add, and we're very proud of it. Yep. So we are very concerned that we continue to make sure in the rural part of our country, where about 40% of our population lives, roughly, have access to the health care they've earned and they so deserve. Now, Dr. Shulkin, I'm going to give you something that has been asked here today, so I know you'll be ready for it. You and I have discussed many times, sat down personally with you and your staff, not these two nice folks, but other folks, about paying your bills on time, okay? Now, I am not a bill collector, but I have no problem doing that on behalf of my constituents. We've had a number of hospitals in my district who have come to us and said, in our state, not only in our district, say, look, we love the VA, we serve veterans at our hospital. We're a nonprofit hospital, and we're just not getting paid on time. Now, I don't worry much, to be honest with you, Mr. Shulkin, about the big hospitals who have the wherewithal to absorb this. But when I get a call from Calais Regional Memorial Hospital in Calais, Maine, where you go all the way down east, you hit Canada, take a left, that's where Calais is. There's not a lot of opportunities out there. And when you folks owe them $600 grand, and I've got to show up, by the way, at HealthNet. By the way, I think, Mr. Chairman, I'm the only office in America that makes house calls now. We just got in a car, and I said, where are these Health Net folks to try to straighten out this problem? We showed up at their doorstep, and they were awfully nice to us. We spent about an hour, and thank them, and I thank you if you were involved, for sending a few people up to Calais to make sure they got paid so they can make payroll. However, my concern, Doctor, going forward is I don't mind making house calls. I will continue to do it, to put pressure wherever it needs to be to get our hospitals paid. But can you assure me now and everybody else in this committee that this new choice program going forward is going to be able to fix this bill paying problem?
Lori, do you want to?
I can see where you passed the buck.
Yeah.
Just like that, Doctor.
Well, thank you for bringing that to our attention. And as you know, we've connected with your providers. Part of what we've done is also implement training and train the providers in terms of the difference between billed charges and Medicare charges as well. The other training we've provided is around submission. The one thing about this legislation, it really allows us to consolidate into one program with multiple programs and multiple eligibility.
When's that going to happen?
It's in the CARE legislation.
Say it again.
It's in the care legislation, having one community care program.
Great.
And so with one program that simplifies eligibility, we've also been improving our business processes, moving from manual, because we touch a lot of our claims, to more electronic processing of claims with our new community care network as well. The TPAs will be providing claims processing, and we will hold them accountable with measures so that they're processing 98% of claims.
So it's going to get better, it's going to get faster, and members of Congress don't have to make house calls.
That's correct. Right? That's
great.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Shulkin, I have a little bit of time left here. In August, we appropriated about $2.1 billion for the next 6 months to make sure choice went on. How are we doing? How much money we got left?
We have, I think, when I saw it last week, about $1.1 billion left.
Are we going to make it through the end of?
Oh, let me make sure I'm accurate.
A little more. When we last looked for medical care, we have 1.4.
Yeah, yeah, but we need to obligate at the very end about 300,000. So you have to stop spending 300 million. So you have to stop spending because of the final obligation. That's why I said it's about 1.1 billion left in the fund. And that's why we will get to the end of the year, but not much beyond that.
Okay.
End of the calendar year.
How can we make sure this is not a continuing problem, Mr. Secretary?
What we're seeking in the President's budget is to permanently authorize the choice program, whatever we're going to call it, Choice 2.0. And that would allow us never to have to go through this exercise of, are we running out of money? We want to permanently authorize this. And that's where the issue of us identifying some financial offsets to pay for this comes in. But we think that this is doable, and it's the right thing to do for veterans.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Rutherford, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, panel, for your very lengthy testimony today, and I really appreciate it, Mr. Secretary. I want to address the issue of physician need within the VA. And I know in the VA's draft legislation and in the minorities legislation, there's a plan to increase the number of resident trainee positions in exchange for service at the VA. And your legislation requests an additional 1,500 residency slots, and the minorities legislation requires VA to increase the financial support for positions, some already authorized in the Choice Act. And it's my understanding that under these plans, residents will not necessarily be taking care of veterans, so VA could actually be paying for care not for veterans, which is one issue. And then the real concern that I have, though, is, as you know, the way residents choose their residency slots is via a matching system in which over 78% of medical students get their first, second, or third pick, and these slots don't come with that service obligation to the VA. And so my question is, why would a medical student commit to service at VA when they know that they have a 3 in 4 chance of getting their, 3 out of 4, chance of getting their selection?
Yeah. Well, two reasons. First of all that we're doing is borrowing from the military model, where students, residents choose to go into the military in exchange for it's paid for and it's exchange for years of service. So we are saying the same thing, which is that we will pay for the training of that resident in exchange for service given back. The reason why I believe that this will be a competitive slot, why students will choose this to do their residency, because of our academic partners. We partner with the very, very best medical schools in the country and the very best residencies. And it is prestigious to get your training at major academic centers. So our partners in academics are not the community hospitals that are training many of the residents, but they are the top teaching hospitals in the country. I believe there'll be competitive spots.
So you don't fear that that the VA would simply get those who don't get their match, which is going to be those folks at the bottom.
Well, the academic centers, I will tell you, having been in charge of graduate medical education for places like the University of Pennsylvania, those places will leave their slots empty and not take non-competitive candidates. So it is the academic partners who are choosing these residents, not the VA.
Okay.
I believe they're going to choose very competitive residents.
So it costs roughly $100,000 a year to train a resident. So assuming a 4-year residency and a 4-year VA commitment, the total cost is $400,000 for. So for the 1,500, it would be $600 million. Of course, that's without administrative costs. I actually have a bill that we've introduced, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it deals with a residency loan payback program that would cost about $160,000 a year for 4 years for that same VA, with that same VA commitment, and that cost would be $240 million for the same number of doctors committed to VA. VA would get to choose the doctors that they want, and I would tell you that they'd also be serving veterans while they're in that program. Would that not be a better program than the graduate medical education proposals now?
Yeah, Dr. Clancy said the same thing to me the other day. So these are the two ways of accomplishing what we both are trying to do.
Right.
And we very much would like to take a look at that bill, and if that gets us where we need to get to, absolutely, because I think that's a very sound way to do it. We were actually trying to create some more slots for the country because, frankly, as I said, there are more U.S. graduating medical students now than residency spots.
Right.
But I absolutely want to do the thing that achieves the objective at the best value for the taxpayer, and we'll work with you on that.
And the best service for our veterans. And I know you.
Absolutely.
I know that's top of your list as well. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Secretary, one final question, and I think probably you know this well, as I've been eager for almost 9 years now to take up legislation for our Blue Water Navy veterans.
Yes.
And place it on a markup agenda. And from our discussions, you know that you share my desire to pass this Blue Water Navy bill as soon as possible. We may be adjusting some of the legislative language, and I hope these changes will allow us to get this bill on the floor as soon as possible to help the remaining thousands of Vietnam veterans. Do I have your support for moving forward on this drafting legislation language to accomplish that goal?
There is no doubt our Vietnam veterans have waited way too long for us to bring this to resolution. The problem, as you know, is this will not be guided by scientific evidence. I wish that's good policy when it does, but it's too late for us to be able to get solid scientific evidence. So we just have to do the right thing, and I appreciate your leadership on this and you wanting to bring this to resolution. I'll be meeting this afternoon with Blue Water Navy veterans. I am absolutely committed to working with you and the rest of the committee to bring this to resolution. They shouldn't be waiting any longer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Wallen, do you have any closing comments? Or?
Just again, thank everyone here, Mr. Secretary, and your team. Thank you to the VSOs. Again, it wasn't a pat on the back to say this is the way it's supposed to work. You're not supposed to get patted on the back for what you're supposed to do, but it is so rare now to bring folks together to continue to get this right, and I appreciate the candid discussion as we move to draft proposal. So thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. And just a final comment, this is an incredibly important meeting because it's going to shape how care is provided for the VA, and we'll have other changes, but basically just to outline it succinctly, it will be a primary care-oriented system, just exactly like our system is around the country now. The gatekeeper or your primary doctor will be managing your care. You'll be able to get some of that care into the VA or outside the VA, depending on where the best care is. And we've heard many good ideas today about how care should be provided both in and out of the VA. So that's one idea. Two, consolidating 7 to 1 makes absolute sense. Takes confusion out, administrative burdens and costs. We do that. Implementing the EHR is a huge undertaking, but that's very much a part of this, how you share back and forth. One of the things that we have a problem now with is sharing information where a doctor is referred a patient from the VA. How do they access the VA's record currently to see what's going on with that patient? Facilities is another issue that we'll bring up later, along with a very innovative new way to practice health care, which is telehealth. And who knows what that's going to look like in 5 or 10 years. We're just on the beginnings of doing that. If you need a specialist and you're at Northport and that specialist is in Denver, you might be able to access that specialist now and very quickly provide the care. So there are huge opportunities here with what we're doing. This is a big undertaking. And Mr. Secretary, I wanted to just amplify what Mr. Walls and the rest of the committee said. Thank you for being available, and thank your team for being available and working with us hand in hand to try to get this as right as we possibly can. So thank you all for being here, and thank you. You're dismissed, and we'll bring our next panel in. Great. Thank you.
Well done. Well done.
Now I'd like to welcome our third panel for the morning, and with introductions. First, Mr. Adrian Elizondo, the Deputy National Legislative Director for the Disabled American Veterans. Welcome. Roscoe Butler, the Deputy Director for Health Care for Veterans and Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation Division of the American Legion. Welcome. And Kata Kelcher, the Associate Director for the National Legislative Service of Veterans of Foreign War of the United States. Thank all of you all for being here and the hard work you do every day for veterans, each and every day. Mr. Elizondo, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on behalf of our 1.3 million wartime service disabled veteran members, I want to thank you for inviting DAV to testify at this legislative hearing. DAV is a nonprofit veteran service organization dedicated to a single purpose, and that's to empower veterans to lead high-quality lives with respect and dignity. We are pleased to offer our views on the bills under consideration by the committee, and for the sake of brevity, I will limit my comments to just a few bills on today's agenda. DAV supports H.R. 2123, the VETS Act of 2017, which would help more veterans receive care from VA employed providers through telehealth. We believe VA, a system designed to meet the unique needs of ill and injured veterans, offers certain patient protections not equally available elsewhere. The ability for VA healthcare system to hold VA providers accountable through training, research, and direct oversight helps establish a standard of care veteran patients enjoy in this otherwise emerging field of healthcare delivery. We are supportive of VA's efforts and the recent regulatory notice to support Secretary Shulkin's Anywhere to Anywhere healthcare initiative. We applaud VA for these efforts. We would also like to thank Representative Banks and his staff for their commitment to work with DAV, the VA, and the VSOs to strengthen the draft bill for a study on the Veterans Crisis Line. DAV Resolution 245, adopted by our members at our most recent national convention, supports improvements in data collection and reporting relative to suicide prevention. Therefore, DAV supports the intent of this bill. We are committed to working with the sponsor and the committee to ensure the data collection efforts proposed in the bill does not have unintended consequences, particularly on the care being delivered, as well as VA's current efforts in collecting and analyzing the effectiveness of their program. Now, regarding the draft bills for care agreements with the State Veterans Home, the draft bill for the CARE Act, and a revised draft bill making permanent the VA Care in the Community program, we would first like to express our deep appreciation for your commitment, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Waltz, all the members on the committee, particularly the staff, for their hard work, as well as VA in their input in finding a way forward to reform the VA healthcare system. Evidenced by many of DAV's recommendations reflected in the committee's revised draft bill, pursuant to our resolution calling for the strengthening, reforming, and sustaining the VA healthcare system. DAV is pleased to support many of the provisions in these measures, which would improve access to care in the community while preserving and enhancing the unique benefits and vital services VA provides to DAV members and all eligible veterans. There are provisions we continue to have concerns and others which we would oppose, such as a proposal to eliminate the current practice of offsetting a veteran's copayment when VA is paid by their health insurance. We urge the committee to stop this proposal from moving forward, as the committee has done with regards to the 10-year COLA round-down. We believe that asking veterans to pay for their health care after they have served and sacrificed is simply not the right thing to do. DAV and our independent budget partners have proposed a comprehensive framework to reform the VA health care based on the principle that it is the responsibility of the federal government to ensure that disabled veterans have proper access to a full array of benefits, services, and supports promised to them by a grateful nation. In order to achieve this goal, our comprehensive framework has 4 pillars: restructure, redesign, realign, and reform. Mr. Chairman, these structures really are guardrails that we hope Congress will take into account when they draft their legislative proposal moving forward. In those instances where VA is unable to deliver timely veteran-centric care, university affiliates, other health partners such as DoD, Indian Health Service, tribal organizations, state organizations such as state veterans homes, Aging and Disability Network, and community providers should be able to meet the obligation to care for our nation's veterans. Our goal is to strike a balance between access to care, simply access, and access to veteran-centric care. This really deals with the creation of local veteran-centric integrated networks to ensure that veterans do not fall victim to fragmented care that is rampant in the private sector. Mr. Chairman, DAV and our members urge serious reform of the VA healthcare system to address access problems while preserving the strengths of the system and its unique model of care. This concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Butler, you're recognized.
Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and distinguished members of the Committee of Veterans Affairs, on behalf of our National Commander, Denise H. Rowan, and the American Legion, the country's largest patriotic wartime service organization for veterans, comprised of more than 2 million members and serving every man and woman who have worn the uniform of this country, we thank you for inviting the American Legion to testify today and share our position regarding the American Legion's position on pending legislation before this committee. You have my written testimony, which discusses the American Legion views and position in great detail. Therefore, I would like to devote the majority of my time discussing the highlights of today's hearing, the CHOICE program. The 2014 wait time scandal helped to expose what veteran service organizations have been warning lawmakers about for years. that the VA has been systematically underfunded and was being forced to manage to budget and not budget to need. Where there is a vision, anything is possible. The draft legislation introduced by this committee, combined with the legislative request for VA, begins to address Congress and VA's vision for the evolution of a 21st century medicine at VA in a way that will allow the department to provide greater access and develop stronger relationships with non-VA providers, moving toward a more integrated system. This is just the first step in a long overdue transformation, and the American Legion expects greater emphasis on VA's modernization in successive legislation that is able to capitalize on VA's strengths and core competencies while ensuring that veterans continue to have access to the best care anywhere. The American Legion is aware of criticism that suggests that this transformation moves purposely close to increased privatization of VA services and does not dismiss these criticisms as without merits. Nefarious intentions can indeed serve to undermine modernization efforts, and the American Legion will continue to be a watchdog and ensure further political interests do not diminish the capacity or value VA represents in the medical or veteran community. It is with this in mind that the American Legion asked this committee to include a requirement in the final legislation that requires VA to ensure an annual report. For the sake of time, I ask that you refer to our written report to review these 6 requirements. This effort to refine and make permanent a consolidated community care program begins a redesign of VA's infrastructure and capabilities that will next cause a review of what services VA hospital and community-based outreach centers perform and how. The legislation language introduced by this committee provides greater detail in a number of areas that VA request lacks, and the American Legion would only caution the committee to remember the number of times VA, VSOs, and the committee were called to introduce and support legislation needed to fix unintended consequences of the original choice legislation. The American Legion is particularly grateful for the committee's diligent and well-articulated procedures as detailed in primary and specialty care in Section 101 of the committee's draft. The American Legion appreciates this committee's dedication and hard work while producing this comprehensive draft, and in our written report highlighted some areas we believe need further discussion, and for sake of time, I will only discuss 2. Included in the VA request is a provision that seeks to increase capacity while saving on emergency room visits by creating or contracting with a network of walk-in clinics. The American Legion believes Section 202, improving veterans' access to walk-in care, will be a benefit for VA patients and will decrease the prevalence of illness that are left untreated because patients are patients are deterred from going to the emergency room until their illness or injury becomes so severe that more costly and time-consuming measures are needed to stabilize and cure the patient. The American Legion is concerned about the introduction of copay features that would be assessed for care directly related to illness or injuries caused or aggravated by a veteran's honorable service. The American Legion looks forward to working with the VA and this committee to come up with a plan to mitigate these charges. Thank you again, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and distinguished members of the Committee on Veterans Affairs. I appreciate the opportunity to present the American Legion's views and look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. Ms. Killer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Walls, and members of the committee, it is my honor to represent the women and men of the VFW and our auxiliary. Over the last 3 years, the VFW has surveyed thousands of members, asking them about their VA care. Their answers are clear. The majority of VFW members like and prefer using their VA healthcare. They want to fix, not dismantle, their healthcare system. This is why the VFW is grateful for the hard work this committee and its staff has put into moving forward, not just with consolidating community care, but overall improvements for a better and stronger VA. While VFW members may prefer using VA, the VFW understands that sometimes care in the community is necessary. Whether that decision is based on a provider shortage for one veteran or travel barriers for another, the VFW thanks this committee and VA for their efforts to ensure if a patient should use VA or community care is a clinical decision made between a patient and their provider. This is also why the VFW believes it is imperative for VA primary care providers to remain the coordinators of care. The VFW is also pleased to see in the committee's draft legislation that this program would finally be made discretionary. This transition from mandatory has been a long time coming and will ensure that the program not only becomes permanent, but also assists in avoiding a gradual erosion of the VA healthcare system. Though we must add that the VFW would oppose using COLA round-downs to offset funding for the CHOICE program. In VA's CARE Act, there are multiple improvements made to personnel practices and collaborations with federal partners, which is something the VFW is eager to see passed into law. Some of these include telemedicine authorities, medical residency programs, partnering with other federal agencies, and a pilot program between VA and DoD healthcare facilities. Moving forward with this legislation, this committee must make sure all unintended consequences are avoided to the fullest extent possible. This includes making sure no veterans are forgotten, such as those in need of a live organ transplant or IVF. The VFW opposes H.R. 3642. All veterans deserve access to mental health care, whether that access be needed due to chronic mental health disorders, current life events, or previous sexual trauma. And aside from data showing that VA has the best mental health care for veterans, VA must also have an active role in coordinating all community care. The VFW has opposed handing out universal choice cards like candy in the past, and we still do. Not only is it opening the floodgates to allow veterans to receive lesser quality care, but it fragments VA's current continuum of care. And this legislation would do so for one of the most vulnerable populations within the veteran community. If all VA survivors of sexual trauma are given a full access card to private providers, they will be faced with most of those providers probably not understanding their veteran-specific needs. VA would have no guarantee of receiving their health records or knowing who to offer the assistance of VA's sexual assault coordinators with. If a veteran who has been sexually traumatized needs care which the VA is unable to provide, then they should absolutely be able to get that care. But if the needs of the veteran can be met by VA, then they should be met by VA. Survivors of sexual trauma are among the highest for increased risk of suicide, and we all know that 14 of the 20 veterans who die by suicide each day are not currently using VA health care. The VFW believes Congress and VA must do all it can to assist sexual trauma survivors, and that means increasing their ability to access VA. The VFW understands the intent of Representative Banks' draft legislation, but must oppose it as written. Though this legislation does not explicitly state VA must begin gathering data not currently collected by VCL, the VFW is concerned that by passing legislation requiring VA to report data not currently collected, that it will result in VA having to collect that data and then gamble with the possible unforeseen consequences. Without asking for personally identifiable information, VA would not be able to report some of the information required in this legislation, such as the number of veterans who contact VCL who have never received VA hospital care or medical services. By forcing VCL to ask for this information to obtain data, the VFW is concerned veterans would be frightened from using the crisis line. And I'm confident we're all aware how fast veterans like to spread information that they're dissatisfied with about VA. And unfortunately, we believe that would only further deter veterans from using the VCL. The VFW is supportive of using data already collected by VA and VCL, such as the data referred to those who use the suicide prevention coordinators or those who VCL must send emergency dispatch to assist. This is why we believe removing reporting requirements for information not gathered by VA must be done before legislation is passed. The VFW would be happy to support this legislation once it removes those reporting requirements and looks forward to working with the committee to make sure that that happens. Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Walz, and members of the committee, this concludes my testimony. Thank you again for the opportunity to represent the nation's largest combat veterans organization, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all, and thank the panel. And I'm going to go rather quickly because I just got to know we have votes at 12:50 to 1:05. So I'll move on. A couple of things. First of all, thank you for working with us. And do any of y'all just briefly see any deal breakers? We've really worked hard on this legislation with you all and other stakeholders, including the Secretary. Is there anything in there that's really a deal breaker in the legislation that you would say this absolutely we wouldn't support it because of this provision?
So, Mr. Chairman, based on the revised draft that we received, not in particular.
Okay.
But
we still want to continue to work with you, absolutely, to iron out these problems that you all clearly brought up, and we want to see if we can work away. But I mean, is there anything in there that's really, because we've tried to avoid that, and if there is, we need to know about it so we can work it out.
Yes, sir. So, as I had mentioned, some of the pay-fors for the bill is a concern for our organization. We understand that is part of a much larger package, and we take that with the consideration of this bill. By all means, we will continue opposing that, of course, but the overall approach, I think, is appropriate. I think a couple of things that require continued clarification, and that really deals with the execution of this bill from VA standpoint. A lot of issues with regards to coordination of care. VA is required to coordinate care, although some of its tools to do that seem to be a little bit hampered. So we have some concerns there, but overall, sir, nothing that would come to the deal breaker, I think, category.
And
Mr. Butler.
Appreciate the bill. We think that the House bill and the VA draft has come a long way, and I think working together, you guys will be able to deliver, the committee will be able to deliver a very comprehensive bill. So we don't see any deal breakers. There are things in our written testimony which we stated we oppose to, but otherwise we think that the bill and VA's draft is a great start.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would agree with my colleagues here that I don't believe there's anything that's necessarily a deal breaker for the VFW. We mirror concerns with the proposals for different pay-fors and offsets, but generally speaking, we're very grateful for committee and staff and how much they've been working with us to iron out those technical differences that we've had and seeing those changes made in the most recent draft legislation.
Well, that goes both ways. I mean,
yes, thank you. There are, as we put in our testimony, different provisions we would like to see added into your committee's legislation. Urgent care, the different personnel provisions that are in Title III and Title IV of the CARE Act, and we're happy to continue working with you to see if we can get those in there, but nothing that's going to make the VFW hit a stop.
Your point on urgent care, I read a statistic the other day that as late as 2010, half the care in this country is provided, half the visits were in emergency rooms. And I think you make a great point. You're seeing these walk-in clinics all over the country, and the VA is doing a pilot project out, I think, in California and in Arizona. And I think those are going to be very helpful to us. It may be not ready for prime time yet, but I think it's coming, where you have access to walk in. I mean, maybe it may be the next thing we do, but I think you're spot on right about that. Easy, convenient care. Maybe keeping the CBOC open until 9 at 10 o'clock at night. Maybe one provider there. I know our practice has an urgent care center with it now. We have about 120 providers in our practice. We open early in the morning before people go to work. We're open until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. You have x-ray, you have all these things that you're able to do. And maybe it won't be that comprehensive in every one, but if you kept it open at a CBOC, I think that's absolutely right. Problem is finding providers. One other thing before my time's expired that I want to get to is that when we were in Canandaigua about, 3 weeks ago, Christine? Yeah, 3 weeks or so ago, I visited Canandaigua. And one of my concerns is, and I told the folks there, and they agreed with it. I said, look, we're doing all this work, and you're answering all these calls, but are we actually reducing suicide by doing it? And we need to evaluate whether we are or whether we're not. That's one thing. And two, on Andy Barr, Congressman Barr's, my concern, I'm an OBGYN doctor, And VAs many times are not set up to take care of women. And we have a program in Tennessee called Guard Your Buddy. And the guard commander told me that he first took over, I think it was 2011. He had in the first 6 or 8 weeks he was a commander, he had like 4 suicides. They've had immediate access to people. You pick up the phone, you called, you're talking to a master's level person literally in a minute or two. They've dropped that number by 70%. So we know that immediate access to care reduces that, and Dr. Winstrup mentioned some other things. My time's expired. I'm preaching now, so I'm going to yield to Mr. Walls.
Well, I would say preach on, brother. We need the choir to sing loudly. We know that's who's here. But to each of you, thank you all. And full disclosure, the millions of veterans you represent, those Dr. Rowe and I included in that up here, we're grateful. We're grateful for that. And I think about those folks who are out there and out in Koochiching County, Minnesota, sitting there watching, if they're still awake or watching this thing, but they're engaged and they want to know, and they're sharing their impact, their experiences, and they just want to get care. They just want it to be as efficient as they possibly can, and they understand that that's going to mean maybe some changes and some sacrifices. But I think Dr. Rowe's question was I'd ask you, keep us appraised of red lines. I know they talk about the sausage making or whatever. At least the sausage making here is done in the open, and it's done forward. And I don't necessarily see sausage making as a pejorative. I represent the Hormel Corporation, and every can of Spam is made in my district. So sausage making is good. But you need to let us know on the red lines. And something Dr. Rowe has done that I very much appreciate, when I have brought up issues, and we've talked about pay-fors, I think a fair challenge was, well, then help me find one that is satisfactory. I would ask all of us and your members, if we can't live with the round down, what would you suggest? How do we go about this? And there's a broad array of things that we can do to make that happen. So I am grateful. So just let us know on that. I just have one question on another bill, a specific one. One of the draft bills on today's agenda seeks to improve veterans' access to same-day mental health care, which is a goal all of us share. It was part of the emphasis on us working together on the Clay Hunt Act and making sure those things happen. So there's great agreement on that. But on this one, it removes VA from the process of allowing community care nonprofit providers decide who is eligible for accessing that care. That idea of the guarantor and the coordinator was always in. And I bring this up because this is nothing new. Many of you in this room remember in 2013 in Atlanta, when we couldn't get in, we gave vouchers to enter the private sector, which basically we lost track of those folks. Well, it turns out a year later, there were 372 people on the waiting list, the back waiting list, in the private sector. VAs showed 0, and it looked like we had great efficiency. The problem was we lost total track of them. We lost total track of how they were getting their care, and many were not getting their care. So I ask you in this, and I know this came late to the review on this piece of legislation, have you got a chance to review this, and what concerns do you have when, again, the goal is noble, the goal is shared, but I am very hesitant because of our experiences on the guarantor and the coordinator. If anyone wants to tackle that, if you're ready.
Mr. Wallace, thank you for asking that question, and I appreciate you recognizing that we got that bill late. We did do a preliminary read on that, and based on that preliminary read, we are unable to support the SAVE Act. I think that's what you're referring to as the SAVE Act. Simply because, you know, military sexual trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, depressive disorder that comes from that event requires not just access. Yes, access is important, but the kind of care they get, the follow-up care that they need, the full range of services beyond just clinical care that VA provides as a provider of military sexual trauma care is what appears to be lacking in this bill. And so that's where our concerns really stems, is yes, it does provide access, but what kind of care is being provided? How does it link up with VA? Like you said, the coordination of care. Many folks that work in the veterans health policy space know that mental health patients in the VA healthcare system require a lot more care and services and benefits than just health care. And so that's where the weaknesses are, I think we see.
for the American Legion, we have not had an opportunity to review it, but we'll get back to you with our comment. But for your explanation of what happened in Atlanta, that is concerning. And so the coordination of care and all of the things that have to come together in such a bill like this, we would have to have the assurance that everything that needs to occur is articulated in that particular bill, so that there isn't any unintended consequences. But we'll review it and get back to you with our official comment. We'll take it for the record.
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member. The VFW mirrors your same concerns with making sure that where these 5 pilot sites would be, making sure VA would have access to the healthcare records, making sure there's the continuum of care, making sure that the veterans who may possibly use that pilot program still have the ability to get into VA for, say, sexual dysfunction or whatever other physical health. I hate using that term because mental health and physical health are all health. Whatever physical ailments they have. And to mirror with your concerns regarding Atlanta and seeing if that might be something that would tie into this, VFW, we had psychologists from the Atlanta VA, which we worked with committee a bit on. After their crisis, the thousands of veterans they had seeking care in the community that they weren't keeping track of, those contracts actually ended in, I believe it was September. And their estimate was they were about to have 1,000 veterans without access to VA mental health care services because they still had the provider shortage. So how would that play out in a pilot such as this if we were allowing everybody to seek private practice in 5 different location sites?
I appreciate that input. We'll follow up on this. It's new to it, and we have work to do.
Thank you. Mr. Pollock, can you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Thank you all very much for being here, for your service to our country. We very much appreciate it. Mr. Dunn has submitted a draft form of a bill, the Victor Act, H.R. 2601. Are you folks familiar with that? Okay. I want to make sure that we submit a copy of this report. For the record, it was in March of 2014, and it was conducted by the Journal of American Medical Association, and it's entitled, "The Association of Distance from a Transplant Center with Access to Waitlist Placement, Receipt of a Liver Transplantation, and Survival Among Our Veterans." And the study effectively concludes that if veterans live beyond 100 miles, that they are less likely to be put on a wait list or on a list for transplants or a transplant, and they have a lower likelihood of actually getting the transplant, and therefore an increased risk of death or severe injury. So my question to you folks, and Ms. Kelleher, if you don't mind, I'll direct this question to you. The study concludes that this 100-mile from a transplant center is not arbitrary. It's based on science. And I know that the sponsors of this bill want to make sure that science backs up this study and that this is recognized. Have you studied this, and how can you comment on that?
Thank you for the question. I will say I haven't seen that study specifically, but the VFW does believe that the decision should be based on patient and provider decision. Clearly want everybody in need of an organ transplant to, aside from actually being able to receive the organ, get that transplant done in the quickest and most efficient manner for the most likely outcome of survival and lack of infection, so on and so forth later on down the road.
Any of you other gentlemen, either of you other gentlemen like to comment?
So thank you for raising that study that is actually in our testimony with regards to the bill. And our organization's position on the bill is such that because we don't have a specific resolution that would allow us to support the bill, we aren't able to take that position. That is to say, we wouldn't oppose its favorable consideration. Clearly, going through a transplant is a kind of procedure that upends somebody's life, not just having it done, but leading up to it. And I think these bills that look at allowing these veterans to be involved in a far more veteran-centric procedure, process, and policy, I think is a good way forward, and hope that this bill does get favorable consideration by this committee.
Thank you. Mr. Butler?
The American Legion supported the bill. We understand and when we did our analysis of everything, we saw either IG or GA report that we included in our written testimony that talked about VA experiencing difficulties in providing timely access to transplant patients. And we believe that that is a critical healthcare need. Veterans can't survive and the donor without the transplant and the ancillary services immediately following the transplant. Mm-hmm. That's a lifelong event. And so we believe that that is a needed service which we support.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I just want to, for the record, again, make sure we submit this, for the record, this study that in fact concludes that there is worse care for veterans that live beyond 100 miles of a transplant center. I know Mr. Dunn from Florida has done a heck of a job on H.R. 2601, and I yield back, sir.
Thank you. And so without objection, so ordered. Mr. Takano, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to say I want to associate myself with Ranking Member Walz's comments earlier about the VA's role as a coordinator of care. I think that's an essential function of the VA. And one of the other bills on the agenda that was added late, and I was disappointed it was added late last week and didn't provide you all with enough time to review the text and prepare testimony, is Representative Gallagher's bill, and it had to do with the veteran suicide. Have you had a chance to review that bill and ascertain whether or not your organization's support can support this bill, and starting with Mr. Addazado? Addazado, I'm sorry, Addazado.
If I thought is this the Military Save Act? Is that what we're talking about something?
No, no. This is the...
I couldn't.
It's the same-day access to mental health care. It has to do with same-day access to mental health care.
Yeah, I think we share the same concerns with regards to the comprehensiveness of that, and I think that the approach of the bill was, if I understand it correctly, was a bit concerning about comparing these services. But I hesitate to answer this question in full. If I could answer that for the record, Mr. Khan, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Please, I would be interested in your response. American Legion?
We did not have an opportunity to review any of the bills that came in late, so we're going to have to go back and take a look at those and then submit our comments for the record.
Great.
VFW will have to submit for the record as well. We don't have an official stance right now.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Addazado, I'll look forward to those responses. Mr. Addazado, in your testimony regarding the minorities draft language, you indicated DAV generally supported the intent of the section that would provide VA with new authorities to incentivize medical students to fill the 1,500 GME slots created under the VA CAA. However, you indicated alternative incentives should be considered as well. Would you care to elaborate on what those alternatives are, in your opinion?
Sure. So I would, first of all, I'd like to take that for the record, Mr. Kano.
Okay.
Only because I know there are specific, there are very specific recommendations that we have, and I don't want to misspeak. This is a very important issue, Mr. Kano.
Well, here's the thing. I appreciated the Secretary's response. I mean, he believes that the sheer numbers of medical students competing for these slots are going to be enough of an incentive for students to compete for slots that will require them to serve in the VA. However, my concern is that certain market realities may actually put that belief in doubt. And why? Because, I mean, I no doubt that many medical students will take the opportunity to serve at the VA. Those slots could be filled. My question is, will they be filled with our best students? I think we need to incentivize our best students to serve at the VA, and I think maybe I would love to hear what the DAV has to say about that. Anybody else have an answer to that question? If not, we'll just take it for the record. Ms. Kelleher, in your written testimony, You mentioned VFW's concern on how VA's CARE Act continues to treat care in the community as a mandatory program. Can you explain why that is so concerning to VFW and what it could mean for VA?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Takano. VFW, as well as I believe all the VSOs here in front of you, supports seeing the choice program being made into discretionary, and we're thankful for the legislation containing that. There's concerns in the community that if the program were to stay mandatory, first of all, we don't want to continuously have the crises that we keep having with having to find money to fund them again, and it's rather exhausting. And then also, we were concerned that over time there would be a gradual erosion of VA healthcare systems. If we're continuously having to find money to put into mandatory spending for VA and community care providers, and then we're having to put up a fight to make sure VA is receiving matching or at least somewhat close to the similar amount of money so that they can continue building VA, whether that be infrastructure, IT, hiring more providers. There's various things that VA needs to continuously do. So by making it discretionary, that makes sure that we're not continuously handing money over that we have to keep finding while allowing money that VA already has to.
We would have to continue to ask the question about the proper balance. Instead of it being an autopilot, mandatory spending, we'd have to continually ask that question and take a look at making sure that our core VA programs are being funded properly.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I now ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Mr. Walsh, you have any closing?
Just final thoughts. Thank you all. And again, I think it's important. Sometimes people don't process. Process does matter. There's one of those veterans I saw, Joe Bouzet, and his service dog were sitting next to me, and he leaned over to me in confidence and said, I don't trust politicians very much, Jim. He said, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful you guys can get this together. They're watching. They're watching how we act. They're watching you as organizations on what we're doing. And once again, I think that word that Joe said, I'm hopeful that we're in a good spot here. I'm hopeful for as your feedback. I always remain committed to that we can find these answers. And again, if we never lose sight, providing quality access to care for our veterans in a timely manner. That's what we're looking for. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Walls, and I totally agree with that. That's the whole purpose of all these hearings this morning. And well, one of the challenges Dr. Shulkin mentioned was he's going to hire 1,000 new mental health providers, and he hires 900 and loses 945. That's going backwards. And I think you see that as I travel around the country to go to VAs, and I'll do some more traveling in a couple of weeks to the West Coast and into the middle part of the country. You hear that a lot. We don't have enough primary care people, but you also hear that in the private sector. It's not just a VA problem. It's a problem of our healthcare system in this country. So what Mr. Takano has done in trying to add new primary care slots at VA, and others are going to come up with ideas to add more slots, I think those are all good ideas. I can't thank you all enough for the work that your teams have put in with putting this choice program, pilot program, not pilot, but program together. Without your help, we couldn't have gotten where we are. We've got a few little things we've got to change, and we'll start working on those this afternoon. We've got our marching orders, and hopefully we can get this marked up. And the reason that we need to do that as soon as we can is because the Secretary just pointed out how much money we have left in the program, and I agree with you on the discretionary versus mandatory. We need to get it in one pot. We can then find out what the needs are and appropriate the money for it. So I agree with that. It makes it simpler certainly to administer. As he pointed out, a 13% administrative fee is incredibly high. That money could be going for health care for veterans or a new clinic somewhere. So I want to thank you all very much, and without any further comments, this meeting is adjourned.
Sully, how are you? I'm well, how are you? I've been working with the Gallagher folks on